Hello, and welcome back. It is late, and whatever the day asked of you, it has finished asking. There is nothing left that will not keep until morning. And no part of tonight requires anything from you at all, except that you lie still and let somebody else do the carrying. This is an evening for anyone who has ever looked at a face in a museum case and felt the strange pull of it. The sense that a person is looking back at you across an almost unimaginable distance, and that you will never know the first true thing about them. So let me take you to Egypt. Not the Egypt of the pyramids, which were already older to her than she is to us, but a stranger and more beautiful moment. A queen with a painted face and a blue crown, a husband who threw out every god his people had, and a city they built out of nothing in the desert and abandoned inside 20 years. You need not hold on to any of it. Just let my voice walk you through. And I will tell you now where we are going, because it is one of the great unsolved things. Her face is one of the most recognized images on earth, and we do not know how she died, or where she lies, or what became of her. And for 100 years, the world told a story about her disappearance that turns out to be wrong, and we only found that out in our own century, from a scratch on the wall of a quarry. Before we go back, let me say one thing, and then I will not step outside the spell again until the very end. If these long walks into other centuries are something you would like to find your way back to on another sleepless night, you are very welcome to subscribe and to let these evenings simply arrive for you when rest is slow in coming. And I like to know who is out there in the dark with me, so if you feel like it, leave a note further down and tell me where you are listening from and what hour it is where you are. Some of you are settling as the light goes. Others are deep in the small hours in a house where everybody else is asleep. I look through those notes often, and there is a particular pleasure in the thought that a woman whose own people tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever say her name again is being listened to tonight, patiently, from so many far apart rooms. Wherever you are welcome here. Imagine this: a bay of desert on the east bank of the Nile, 300 miles up the river from the sea, with the light going amber and the cliffs behind it turning the colour of a peach. It is a wide, flat, empty half-circle of sand and gravel, perhaps 8 miles across, ringed at the back by a wall of limestone that glows when the sun drops. Nothing is here. No temple, no town, no shrine, no field. In all the thousands of years that Egypt has been Egypt, and it has already been Egypt for longer than the time between this evening and yours, nobody has ever built anything on this ground or claimed it for any god. It is simply a stretch of desert that the river passes, and a man is standing on it in a chariot, looking at the cliffs. And he is going to put a city here. Let me set the world around him, though, before we go any further. You cannot understand what these two people did, unless you understand how much they had to lose. The Egypt that Nefertiti was born into, around 1370 years before our era, was at the absolute summit of its power, and it had been climbing towards that summit for a very long time. Sit with the depth of the time for a moment, because it is the thing people find hardest, and it changes how the rest of the evening feels. The Great Pyramid at Giza was already 1,200 years old when she was a girl. 1,200 years. She was further away from the men who built it than we are from the Norman conquest of England. When Egyptians of her age went to look at the pyramids, they went as tourists, to gawp at something impossibly ancient made by people they barely understood, and some of them scratched their names on the stone while they were there. And the graffiti is still legible. Egypt in her lifetime was not a young country doing something new. Egypt was an old, old civilization, with an enormous past behind it, absolutely certain of what it was. And in this particular century, it was also, for the first and only time, an empire. The kings of her grandfather's generation had marched out and taken everything down into Nubia in the south for gold, and up the coast of the Levant in the north until Egyptian garrisons sat in the cities of Canaan and Syria, and the great powers of the age sent gifts and daughters. Gold came in by the boatload, cedar came down from Lebanon, copper, silver, lapis from the mountains beyond Persia, ebony and ivory and leopard skins and living giraffes from the far south. There is a moment in the diplomatic correspondence of this era where a foreign king writes to the pharaoh in tones of open envy and says that in Egypt gold is as common as dust. He is not being poetic. He is complaining. The city, at the center of it, was Thebes, on the river 300 miles south of the delta, and Thebes at this moment was very probably the richest and most spectacular city on the face of the earth. On the east bank stood the temple of Amun at Karnak, which was not a building so much as a small walled country of buildings, growing for centuries as each king added his own hall and his own pylon and his own forest of columns, until the whole thing covered an area you could set a modern town inside. Obelisks of red granite, quarried in one piece, dragged 400 miles down the river and stood upright by men with ropes and ramps and no machinery of any kind, sheathed at the tips in electrum so that at dawn they caught the first light and burned, doors of Lebanese cedar plated in gold, floors of silver. Rooms of the god that only a handful of people alive were ever permitted to enter. Across the water, on the west bank, the dead, the valley where the kings were buried cut into the rock in secret, and the mortuary temples of those kings ranged along the edge of the cultivation, and beyond them the desert. That is the Egypt she was born into. Rich past the point of decadence, ancient past the point of arrogance, and completely, serenely sure that the arrangement of the world had been settled a long time ago and would not be changing. And here is the thing about that arrangement that matters most tonight, because everything that follows is a reaction to it. Egypt had gods in the way a forest has trees, hundreds of them, thousands, if you counted the local ones. Each town its own deity, each river bend its own spirit, and in the houses small protective figures on a shelf. There were gods with the heads of falcons and cats and crocodiles and ibises and jackals. There were gods who were abstractions, and gods who were places, and gods who had been kings. They overlapped and merged and contradicted each other, and nobody minded in the slightest, because Egyptian religion was not a system of belief that you signed up to. It was the weather. It was simply how the world was. And it had worked for 2,000 years. And the proof that it worked was that the river rose every summer and the country was rich. Above all of them, in this century, stood Amun, the hidden one, a god of Thebes who had risen with the city and been fused with the sun god Ra into Amun-Ra, king of the gods, and who had been given the credit for the empire, because when the kings marched out and won, they came home and gave the god his share. And the god's share was enormous, and that is where our story really begins. Because by the time a girl called Nefertiti was growing up in that world, the temple of Amun at Karnak owned land and towns and ships and mines and herds and tens of thousands of people, and the high priest of Amun was one of the most powerful men in Egypt, and he was not the king. And underneath all of it, the gold, the obelisks, the empire, the god, there was one thing that made Egypt possible, and it came up out of the ground every summer. The river rose. I want to give you this properly, because we say the word inundation and move on, and it was the central fact of life in that country for 4,000 years. Including hers, Egypt is a desert. That is what to hold on to. It is one of the driest places on the face of the earth. There are parts of it where rain is a story people tell, and through the middle of that desert runs a river that, every year, without being asked, floods, because 2,000 miles away in the Ethiopian highlands the monsoon comes. And the water comes down, and by high summer it arrives in Egypt as a great slow rise. It did not smash. It swelled. Through July and August it came up, and up until the valley was a shallow brown sea from cliff to cliff, with the villages standing on their little mounds like islands and the palm trees out in the water, and the boats going wherever they liked, over what had been somebody's barley field. And then, through the autumn, it went down again, and it left behind, on each acre it had covered, a fresh layer of black silt carried down out of Africa. That is the whole miracle. The soil was fertilized, free, year upon year, by the river, and it never wore out. Mesopotamia salted its soil and eventually broke. Egypt did not, because that silt came back season upon season for millennia. The Egyptians called their country the Black Land, after that mud, and the desert on either side the red. And the border between them was so sharp you could stand with 1 foot in each. And so the year had 3 seasons, and all of Egypt lived by them. Akhet, the rising. When the valley lay under water and there was no farming to be done, which is exactly when the state called men up to haul stone, because they were idle and the water made it easy to float enormous weights to where you wanted them. Pere, the coming forth, when the water fell back and the mud lay there and everybody went out and planted. And Shemu, the harvest and the drought. When the grain came in and the river shrank to its lowest, and the country held its breath, because it could fail. That is the other side of it. And it is what made the Egyptians so careful with their gods. A low water reached fewer acres, and fewer acres gave thinner harvests, and a thin harvest was hunger, and a run of poor years brought famine and the collapse of governments. And it had happened, and everybody knew it had happened. Too high was no better. It took the villages. So the whole apparatus of Egyptian religion, all those gods and rituals and offerings, was in a real sense an enormous, elaborate, deadly serious insurance policy on a river. The king's job, the actual job, underneath the crowns, was to keep the arrangement working, to keep the gods content, so that the water came up the right amount at the right time, and the country ate for another year. Now hold that up against what her husband was about to do. He was going to take the entire pantheon. The whole apparatus that Egypt believed was holding the flood in place, and switch it off, not reform it, close it. And tell 60 generations worth of accumulated anxiety that from now on there was one God, and it was the sun, and it had no myth and no story, and did not deal with anybody except the king. And the farmers of Egypt watched the water that summer, and the next, and the one after that, and waited to see what would happen. Hold that. It matters more than anything else I will tell you for the next hour. Now let us try to find the girl herself. And immediately we run into the trouble that shapes everything. We do not know who her parents were. I want to be honest about this at the start, because it is not a small gap, and I am not going to paper over it. The most famous woman of the ancient world, whose face is in every book. And there is not a single line anywhere, in any inscription, on any wall, in any letter, that tells us who her mother and father were. Nothing. It is not that the record is damaged. It is that nobody wrote it down. Or if they did, it has not survived. And we are left standing in front of the most recognizable face in the world, with no idea whose daughter she was. What we have is her name, and the name is a clue that has misled people for a century. Nefertiti. In the Egyptian it means, roughly, the beautiful one has come, and for a long time that was taken as a foreigner's name. An arrival, a woman who came from somewhere else. It fed a wonderfully romantic theory that she was a princess of Mitanni, the great kingdom in what is now northern Syria, sent to Egypt as a diplomatic bride. There was even a candidate, a Mitanni princess called Tadukipa, who really was sent to Egypt in this very generation, first to Nefertiti's father-in-law, and then, when he died, passed on to his son. It is a lovely story, and almost nobody believes it anymore. The name works perfectly well as an Egyptian name. Egyptians gave their children names that were sentences. And a name meaning the beautiful one has come is exactly the sort of thing a delighted Egyptian family would call a baby girl. And Tadukipa can be traced separately in the record. So the foreign princess has quietly been put away. The better guess, and it is a guess, and I will keep saying so, is that she was Egyptian and of the highest rank, and the daughter of a man called Ai. Ai is one of the more remarkable figures in this whole period, a courtier of enormous influence, who was at the center of things for decades, and who eventually, when everyone else was dead, put the crown on his own head and ruled Egypt himself as an old man. And there is a piece of circumstantial evidence connecting him to Nefertiti that is genuinely elegant. His wife was a woman called Tay, and Tay carries in her titles the description of nurse to the queen. She was the woman who fed and raised Nefertiti as an infant. Now think about what that tells you and what it does not. It puts Nefertiti in Ai's household from infancy. But that is not the same as being a mother. You do not hand your own baby to another woman to feed and then advertise the fact in your titles. So the conclusion most scholars land on is this. Nefertiti was Ai's daughter by an earlier wife who died, and Tay was her stepmother and raised her and was proud enough of it have it carved on her tomb wall, which would make Nefertiti a girl of the innermost court circle, brought up in the household of the most influential man at the palace, in the presence of the royal family, from the day she was born. That is a guess. Let me say it once more, so it does not harden into a fact while you are drifting. Nobody knows. She may have been Ai's daughter. She may not, and the rest of her childhood is simply gone. There are no anecdotes. There is no description. There is no letter, no memory, no scene. Everything we would want. What she was like as a child, whether she was clever, whether she was kind, what she wanted. None of it was ever written, because the Egyptians did not write that sort of thing about anybody. And they especially did not write it about girls. What we can do is furnish the room. A girl of her rank grew up in a large mud brick villa with painted walls and a garden and a pool in the shadow of the palace. She would have been taught to run a household. She was almost certainly taught her letters, which was rare and precious literacy in Egypt, ran at something like 1 person in 100. And those 100 were mostly men. And to be a woman of the court who could take in a document unaided was to hold a genuine key. She would have learned music because the court ran on it. And she would have grown up watching the royal family at close range, learning by observation the thing that everybody in that circle learned first: how power actually moves through a room, and who has it, and how you get near it. And then, at what we think was around the age of 12, she was married. She was married into the family of a king, who was, at that moment, presiding over the most golden and self-satisfied court Egypt had ever seen, Amenhotep III. Her father-in-law has come down to history with the name Amenhotep the Magnificent, and for once the flattery is roughly accurate. He ruled for something like 38 years, and in almost the whole of that time, Egypt did not have to fight a serious war. That is the rarest luxury a state can have, and he spent it exactly as you would expect, on building. And on pleasure, he built at a scale that is difficult to describe without sounding like a brochure. He put up the temple at Luxor. He raised a mortuary temple on the West Bank, so vast that almost nothing of it survives except the 2 enormous seated statues of himself that guarded the gate, which still sit out there in the fields, 60 feet high, with their feet in the mud, and which the Greeks, 1,000 years later, would come and stare at, and name after a hero of Troy, because they could not imagine what they were really looking at. And he built himself a pleasure palace on the West Bank called Malkata, which is one of the most extraordinary things in Egypt, and almost nobody has heard of it. It was not a fortress. It was not a temple. It was a sprawling, low, mud brick paradise audience halls and apartments and kitchens and villas for the court, the walls and ceilings painted with vines and marshes and flying ducks and swimming fish, the floors painted with pools. He had a harbour dug for it, and he had a lake dug beside it, a genuine artificial lake, so that he and his queen could be rowed about on the water in the evening. The workmen cut it, we are told, in 15 days. His queen, and she matters enormously for what happens next, was called Tiye. She was not royal, she was the daughter of a provincial official. And the king married her early, and then did something no Egyptian king had done before. He put her name in a cartouche beside his own, publicly, over and over, in the official record. For the whole of his reign, she is shown at his scale. She appears in his diplomatic correspondence, and there is a letter from a foreign king who, wanting something from Egypt after Amenhotep's death, writes to Ta directly and tells her plainly that she knows more about her husband's business than anyone alive. Look at what that establishes. Because it is the ground Nefertiti will stand on. The generation immediately before her had already made an Egyptian queen, a visible, named, public partner in the business of ruling. Nefertiti did not invent the powerful queen. She inherited the idea from her mother-in-law, and then took it somewhere nobody had imagined. And the last piece of Amenhotep III's reign is the one that will matter more than any of it. Late in his life, quietly, without any fuss, this most conventional of kings began paying a little extra attention to a small and rather obscure aspect of the sun god. Not Ra in his falcon shape, not the great state god, something more abstract, the physical disk of the sun itself. The thing in the sky, which the Egyptians called the Aten. He called his pleasure barge after it. A division of his army was given the same title. It was a mild, fashionable, harmless bit of royal theology, and nobody in Egypt could possibly have looked at it and seen what was coming. Because he had a son, the son was not supposed to be king. And I think about that a great deal, because it may be the whole explanation. Amenhotep III had an elder son, a boy called Thutmose, who was the crown prince and was being brought up to it in the ordinary way. And who died? We do not know of what. He simply stops. And the crown fell instead on a second son, who had not been raised to expect it, who had not been standing at the front of the room being groomed, and who had spent his childhood somewhere off to the side. His name was Amenhotep, like his father. And Egypt was about to discover that it had crowned something it had no vocabulary for. Here is what we can honestly say about him. And it is less than people pretend. He is one of the most written about pharaohs in history and one of the least known. We have no letter from him about himself. We have his hymns, which are magnificent, and which I will come to, and we have his monuments, and we have the extraordinary way he had himself depicted. And out of those three things, people have built 100 contradictory men. The first monotheist, the first individual, a visionary, a fanatic, a tyrant, a poet, a man with a rare disease, a saint. He has been claimed by everybody. He is a mirror, and what people see in him is mostly themselves. What is not in doubt is what he did, and it is without parallel anywhere in the ancient world. Now the wedding, which is where our subject walks into the room. We do not know the year for certain. It was probably shortly before he became king, or in the very first part of his reign. The sort of match that gets arranged by the court around a young prince, as a matter of course. She was about 12. He was perhaps 16 or 18. Nobody asked either of them anything. And it would not have occurred to anyone that they should. And I want to be careful here, because there is a temptation to go straight to romance. And the evidence for romance is real, but it comes later, and it comes from art, which is not the same as evidence about feelings. What we can say about the wedding itself is only this: a girl of the inner court, of the highest rank and unknown parentage, was married to the spare son of the richest king on earth. It was not a remarkable event. It did not go into the annals. Nobody outside the palace would have noticed, and within about 5 years the two of them would abolish the gods of Egypt. Before we go further, let me tell you what it actually was to be a woman in that country, because it is one of the genuine surprises of the ancient world, and it is the ground everything else stands on. Egyptian wives and daughters held rights that Europe would not hand back for 3,000 years. I am not exaggerating for effect. Set the list out and see. She could own property in her own name: land, houses, servants, cattle, ships outright, not through a husband or a guardian, and do with it exactly as she liked. She could buy and sell. She could lend money at interest. She could make a will and leave it all to whomever she chose. And we have testaments where they do precisely that, and occasionally cut out a relative who had annoyed them. She could go to court. Not through a man herself, in her own person, as a full party. She could sue and be sued and give evidence, and we have the records of them winning. She could divorce. Either party could end a marriage. And the property arrangements on the way out were serious. A woman took back what she had brought in, and there were settlements. And in some contracts, the husband agreed in advance to a penalty if he left her. There is a marriage contract that survives, in which the man promises that if he puts her aside, he will pay her a fixed weight of silver. And that is not romance. That is somebody with a lawyer. She kept her own name. All her life, she did not become somebody's missus on a monument. She is her father's daughter, and stays so. Now put that next to Greece, 500 years later, which we are pleased to call the birthplace of the West. An Athenian of good family could not own anything worth the name if she were female. She could not go to court. She could not make a contract above the value of a bushel of barley. She was under a male guardian from cradle to grave, and she was not supposed to leave the house much. And when the Greeks came to Egypt, they were frankly scandalized. There is a Greek writer who reports, in tones of amazement, that in Egypt, the wives go to market and do the trading, while the men stay at home and weave. And he clearly thinks he is describing a country where everything is upside down. And here is the wall, and it is the same wall we always come to. None of that was power. Not one of them could hold public office. Not one could be a vizier, or a general, or a governor, or a judge. The priesthoods open to them were real, but were not the ones with the treasuries. Literacy, which was the key to the entire administrative class, the way in for any man of ambition, was almost entirely male, because the scribal schools took boys. So she could own half a street and have no say in who governed it, and she could take her husband to court and could not take a case for anybody else, and she could grow rich and could never, at any point, be anything at all in the running of the country. There was a single exception, and it was the throne, and it was not really an exception, because it worked through blood rather than through her. Kingship in Egypt passed in the male line, but legitimacy ran partly through the royal mothers and daughters, which meant a queen could be enormously significant and still not be the thing itself, and a handful had gone further. Hatshepsut, 150 years before Nefertiti, had ruled as king outright, with the beard and the titles, for 2 decades, and made Egypt rich and built one of the loveliest buildings on earth. And after she died, her successor had her name cut off the monuments, and her statues smashed and thrown in a pit, which is worth marking, because it tells you the precedent Nefertiti was standing on and the fate that came with it. Egypt could produce a female king. It could not forgive one. So let me show you what they were about to take on, because it was not a vague thing. It was an institution with a bank. Ammon of Thebes was, by this century, the most powerful religious corporation the world had yet produced. And the word corporation is not a cheap modern joke. It is the accurate description. Understand how an Egyptian temple actually worked. Because it was not a church, and it did not have a congregation. A temple was the house of the god. The god lived in it physically in the form of a statue in a dark room at the back. And that statue was not a symbol of the god. It was where the god was. And the god had to be looked after in the way a very great person is looked after. Every morning the sanctuary was unsealed, and the god was woken, washed, dressed, anointed with scented oil, and given breakfast. Every evening he was put to bed. This happened every day for centuries, without a break, and the whole apparatus of the Egyptian state existed, in a sense, to make sure it never stopped, because if it stopped, the world would come apart. Now, who paid for that? The king, in theory. In practice, the god had been given estates, enormous estates, granted by grateful kings after victories, accumulating century after century, with nothing ever going back the other way, because you cannot take land off a god. By the reign of Amenhotep III, the Temple of Amun held a share of Egypt that is genuinely startling. Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of head of livestock, fleets of ships, whole towns, mines, workshops, orchards, and a great slice of the arable land of the richest agricultural country in the world. And it was not merely rich, it was employed. Priests in their thousands, scribes, accountants, bakers, brewers, butchers, weavers, gardeners, doorkeepers, singers, musicians, guards. It was the largest employer in the country after the crown, and quite possibly not after. And at the top of it sat the high priest of Amun, who was appointed by the king in theory, and who in practice had become one of the great powers of the state, with his own wealth, his own following, his own interests, and no reason at all to be grateful. Now put yourself in the position of a young king. Every victory your family has ever won has been credited to Amun. Every temple your ancestors raised made Amun richer. The god's establishment now owns a chunk of your country you cannot tax and cannot touch. His priests interpret his will, which means they interpret the will of the god who is supposed to have put you on the throne, which means, if you follow it all the way down, that the men in that temple hold a claim on your legitimacy that you do not control. You are the king, and there is an institution in your capital city that is older than your dynasty, richer than your treasury, staffed by thousands, and which speaks for the God who made you. Historians have argued for a century about whether what came next was faith or politics, and I will tell you where I land, which is that the question is badly put. He was not choosing between a religious motive and a political one. In that world there was no line the god, and the state were the same object viewed from different angles. And a king who wanted to break the priesthood would necessarily do it in the language of the gods, because there was no other language available. What he did was both. It could not have been anything else. And it began, in the 4th year of his reign, with a builder's yard. Here is the strangest thing about the most famous religious revolution in the ancient world. It started as an architectural project, and its first great monument belonged, in part, to a woman. In year 4, at Karnak, in the shadow of Amun's own house, on the god's own doorstep, which is an act of extraordinary cheek when you think about it, the young king broke ground, not for Amun, for the Etten, that mild fashionable sun-disk his father had liked, and he worked at speed, using a trick that tells you everything about how much of a hurry he was in. Egyptian temples had always gone up in enormous blocks, because enormous blocks last forever, and the point was forever. He used small ones, a standard block, small enough for one man to carry, roughly the size of a large brick. We call them talatat. With them a crew could throw up a temple wall in a fraction of the time, because you did not need ramps and sledges and hundreds of men to move a single stone. You needed a line of workers passing blocks hand to hand. He raised 4 of them at Karnak in a very few years. He was not working for eternity. He was working for now, and quickly, and the choice would have consequences he could not have imagined. And these were not houses of a god in the Egyptian sense. That is the point that changes everything. An Egyptian temple went from glare to gloom. You came in through the huge gate into a courtyard, then a hall of columns, then narrower chambers, and it grew lower and dimmer and more secret with every step until you reached the black cell at the back where the god was. And only the king and the highest priests ever went inside. Egyptian religion was a religion of the shut chamber. The Aten courts had no roof. Think about that. He laid out enormous courts, full of altars, standing wide to the sky. There was no sanctuary, there was no statue, there was nowhere to shut anything away, because there was no image of the god to keep. The god was the thing in the sky, and you could see it, and it was looking at you. The whole architecture of Egyptian holiness, the entire logic of approaching a hidden power through a sequence of ever more private chambers, was simply deleted. The god was overhead, in plain sight, and the ritual was performed under it, in front of hundreds of altars. in the full glare. For an Egyptian, this would have been almost physically disorientating. It is like being told that the cathedral has lost its roof and its altar and its images, and that from now on you worship in the open at noon, and in the middle of that complex stood the Benben, and it was hers. I want to slow down here, because this is her first appearance in the story as something other than somebody's wife, and it is astonishing, and it is not well known, that Benben, the mansion of the Benben stone, was one of the 4 Aten structures at Karnak. And when we look at the thousands of Talatat blocks recovered from it, the king is not there. He does not appear. The scenes are of Nefertiti performing the offering before the Aten alone, sometimes with a daughter beside her. Over and over. Understand what that means in the world I have just described. Offering to the god was the king's act. It was the definition of kingship. Every sanctuary in Egypt for 20 centuries shows the same thing. The king faces the god and makes the offering, and that transaction is the hinge the whole cosmos turns on. It is not a ceremony the king performs. It is what a king is for. The queen's normal place in that picture is behind him, smaller, shaking a rattle. And here is an entire building in which the queen does it herself, and the king is absent. There is nothing like it. Not before, not after, not anywhere. Some scholars have wondered whether it means she was functioning as a kind of priest in her own right. Others whether the theology needed a divine pair to mirror the sun. Others whether it is simply what happens when a young king with total power decides his wife should have a temple. Nobody can settle it, but you cannot make it small. Whatever else was going on in that marriage, in the first years of the reign, this young man built his wife a temple of her own, on the doorstep of Amun, and put her in the king's place on its walls. The block survived because of an irony that is one of the great jokes of archaeology. When later kings tore all this down, and they tore all of it down, the Talatat turned out to be exactly the right size and shape to be useful as rubble, and so her temple did not go to the lime kilns. It went inside somebody else's wall. And waited. They tried to erase her. They used her as gravel, and the gravel kept her. And I want to give you one more thing about that first temple at Karnak, because there is a number attached to her there that I still find hard to take in. When the Talatat from those 4 buildings were catalogued and the scenes worked out, somebody counted how often each member of the family appears, and Nefertiti appears roughly twice as often as her husband, twice, in his temple, in his own upheaval. In the first monuments of the new god, raised on the doorstep of the old one, in the reign of a king who was in the process of making himself the only route to the divine that Egypt possessed. The queen is on the walls twice as much as he is. I have turned that over for a long time, and I do not have a tidy explanation, and I distrust the tidy ones on offer. It is not simply that he loved her, though he may have. It is not simply politics. Because there was no faction to appease, nobody in Egypt was agitating for more images of the queen, and it cannot be an accident of survival. Because we are talking about a count across tens of thousands of blocks from the same set of buildings. The nearest I can get is this. He was building a faith with one god in it, and that god had no consort, and no myth, and no family. In every previous Egyptian theology, there had been pairs and households and generations gods, with wives and sons and daughters, an entire divine society. He had swept all of that away and left a disk in the sky. And a disk in the sky cannot love anybody and cannot be loved back. And a creed with nothing in it but a physical object and a set of rays does not give people anything to hold. So the household went into the gap. The pair on the walls, the girls between them. The hands coming down onto the 2 of them, and nobody else. That is where the warmth of the thing had to live, because there was nowhere else for it to be. The Aten had no wife, so the king's wife did the work. And if that is right, then she was not decorating any of it. She was load-bearing in it. Take her off those walls, and there is nothing left but geometry. which may also be the answer to the question everybody asks about the end. Why the whole thing collapsed within a few years of his death and never came back. When Egypt had accepted new gods before and would again, it had no roots. It lived entirely in one couple, in one city. And when the couple were gone, there was nothing underneath it at all, not one shrine in any workman's house, not one household figure. 20 years of the most beautiful art in the ancient world, and it never got past the walls and into the people, because the only thing it ever really offered anybody was the sight of a family in the light. And then, in the 5th year of his reign, the young king changed his name. And there was no going back. Amenhotep means Amun is content. You can see the difficulty. A king who was dismantling the house of Amun could not go on being called Amun is content. So he became Akhenaten, which means, roughly, he who is effective for the Aten, or the one who serves the disk. And his wife's name was extended too. From that point, she is Nefertiti, the beauty of the beauties of the Aten. The beautiful one has come. Changing a royal name in Egypt was not like a modern person changing theirs. A king's names were a piece of theology. They were the formal statement of what his reign was for, carved everywhere, spoken in every temple, written on every document. To change it was a public constitutional act. He was telling the country, in the only language that mattered, that the arrangement of the last 20 centuries was finished. And what was the Aten, exactly? This is worth getting right, because it is usually got wrong. The Aten was not a sun god in the way Ra was a sun god. Ra had a face, a body, a boat, a family, a mythology, a journey through the underworld every night. Enemies to fight. The Aten had none of that. It had no myth. It had no image in human or animal form at all, and that is the radical part. Because in Egypt, everything had an image. What it had instead was a symbol. And the symbol is one of the most beautiful things anybody in the ancient world ever devised. A plain disc, with long straight rays coming down from it, and at the end of each ray a small human hand. Sometimes the hands are simply open, sometimes they hold out the sign for life to the nostrils of the king and queen. That is the whole iconography. Light, coming down, ending in hands. It is not a god you can meet. It is not a god with a story. It is a god you can feel on your skin the moment you step outside. And that is precisely the point. The Aten is not hidden. Amun's name meant the hidden one. The Aten is the opposite of hidden. It is the most obvious thing in the world, and it is above everybody, everywhere, at the same time over Egypt, and over Syria, and over Nubia, over the rich and the poor, without partiality. And there is a line in the great hymn that says almost exactly that. Was it monotheism? Cautiously, something close, and it went further than anything before it, and the argument has never stopped. Other gods were not merely neglected. Eventually, their names were cut out of the stone all over Egypt, and the plural word for gods was itself attacked, which is about as clear a statement as a state can make. But there is a catch, and it is a large one. Ordinary people were not invited to worship the Aten directly. The Aten's worshipper was the king. The people's route to the god ran through him. You prayed to Akhenaten. And Akhenaten dealt with the disk, so the new religion did not liberate anybody from a priesthood. It replaced a priesthood of thousands with a priesthood of one, and the one was the king. And his wife stood beside him, in the god's own light. You can see, can you not, why they had to leave Thebes. Before we go out to the desert with them, look at what happened to Egyptian art, because it is the part of this story you can actually see, and it is the strangest thing of all. Egyptian art had rules, not conventions rules. In the engineering sense, set down at the very beginning and followed for 2,000 years with almost no deviation. There was a grid. A figure was laid out on a squared grid so that every proportion was fixed. So many squares from the sole of the foot to the knee, so many to the shoulder, and the same for everybody, everywhere, for 100 generations. That is why a statue from the Old Kingdom and one made 1,000 years afterwards look like siblings. It was not that nobody could draw differently. It was that drawing differently was not the point. The point was to make an image that was correct. Because an image was not a picture of a person. It was a vessel the person could occupy, and a vessel with the proportions wrong is a broken vessel. And the rule about kings was the strictest of all. A pharaoh was shown young, fit, calm, symmetrical, and perfect, from his first year to his last, whether he was 19 or 80, whether he was a warrior or an invalid. The face might carry a family resemblance. The body never varied. A king was not a man. A king was an office wearing a man, and the office does not age. Now look at what Akhenaten had made of himself. A long, narrow, heavy-jawed face, enormous almond eyes, half-closed, thick lips, a neck so long and thin it looks like it should not hold the head up, narrow, sloping shoulders, and then a body that no Egyptian king had ever been permitted. A soft, heavy belly hanging over the belt, wide swelling hips, full thighs, and a chest modelled more like a woman's than a king's. In some of the colossal statues from Karnak, the effect is genuinely shocking even now, this vast, drooping, androgynous figure, standing 13 feet high in the sunlight, where a lean young war god ought to be. People have been trying to explain it for 150 years. And the theories tell you more about the theorists than about him. He had a genetic disorder, Marfan syndrome, or Froelic's, or a dozen others. A whole medical literature exists diagnosing a man from his own propaganda, which is not a thing any doctor would accept in any other context. Or he was a woman. Or he was making himself into both sexes at once, mother and father of his people, because the Aten had no consort, and the king had to carry the whole of creation in his own body. Or, and this is where most of the field now sits, and where I sit too, it is theology, not biology. The images of his family are in the same style. His daughters have the same long skulls and heavy hips. The courtiers on the tomb walls have them too. Everybody at Amarna caught the king's shape, which is a strange sort of disease. When the sculptors modelled a real head from life, and we have those from Thutmose's workshop, they made faces of extraordinary, delicate, unexaggerated naturalism. They could clearly see perfectly well. They were not drawing what they saw. They were drawing a doctrine. But leave the king's body aside, because it is not the important part. And it is not the part that matters for our subject. The important part is what happened to everything else. The line loosened. That is the only way I can put it. After 2 millennia of rigid, beautiful, frozen correctness, Egyptian art suddenly went soft and quick and observant. Ducks burst up out of a marsh in a scatter of wings instead of hanging in a tidy row. A horse tosses its head, grain bends, a servant girl scratches herself, and in the palace scene something appears that had never once been shown in 20 centuries and would never really appear again. A family, not a king with attendant figures, a family. The king and the queen sitting on cushioned chairs facing each other, with their small daughters swarming over them. One child on Nefertiti's shoulder, one reaching up to touch her mother's chin. One perched in the king's lap while he leans down to kiss her, an Egyptian pharaoh on a carved monument, kissing a baby. In another, the queen sits with a child on each knee and one against her cheek. In another, a princess leans on a cushion, exhausted, and no one has bothered to make her decorative about it. You have to understand how absolutely without precedent this is. Egyptian royal art did not do affection. It did not do gesture. It did not do children as children. A royal child was a small adult with a sidelock. This is a court that suddenly commissioned images of itself as a household over and over for public display, in stone, in temples, in the tombs of its officials, at a scale nobody had attempted, and she is everywhere in it. That is the point I want to leave with you. In the art of the Amarna years, Nefertiti is not an accessory. She is in the chariot. She is at the window. She is at the offering table. She is in the boat. She is the same size as her husband, which in the grammar of Egyptian art means the same importance. Full stop. In some scenes, she is standing where a king stands and doing what a king does. No one made her do that. There was no constituency demanding it. Two people in a palace decided that this was how the world should be shown, and the sculptors carved it. And for 17 years, it was the official truth of the Egyptian state. And since we have been talking about how she was shown, let me tell you what she actually had on. Because we know a great deal, and almost none of it is guesswork. Start with the crown, because it is hers, and nobody else has it. The tall, flat-topped blue headdress you know from the bust is not a standard piece of Egyptian regalia. Queens before her had the vulture cap, or the double plumes, or the modius. This is something else, a deep blue cap that rises straight up and cuts off flat at the top, with a golden band running round it like a ribbon and joining at the back, and a cobra rearing over the brow. It appears with her and essentially no one else, and its meaning is lost. The best guess is that it is a version of the blue war crown of the kings, adapted for her, which, if it is right, is one more piece of the same pattern. She is wearing the king's headgear in a shape cut for a woman. Under it, almost certainly, she was shaved. This is the thing that surprises people most, and it is well attested. Elite Egyptians of both sexes kept their heads shaved or cropped for cleanliness and against lice, in a hot country with no shampoo, and they went about in wigs. Real hair, mostly. Sometimes with plant fibre worked in, set in hundreds of tiny plates, and fixed with a warm mixture of beeswax and resin. We have the wigs. And we have analysed the wax. A good one was a serious investment, and was kept in its own box, on a stand, the face. Kohl round the eyes, which is the most recognisable thing about an Egyptian face, and which was not only about beauty. The black is galena, a lead or ground fine, and it cuts the glare off the sand the way an athlete's eye black does. And there is modern work suggesting the lead salts in it actually did something useful against eye infection in a country of flies and dust. Green from malachite as well, in the older fashion. Red ochre on the lips and the cheeks. Henna on the palms and the soles and the nails. And the oil, which is the part people forget, and which mattered more than any of it. Egypt is an oven with a river in it. Skin cracks. So everybody, from the queen to the man carrying bricks, was oiled, and this is not a luxury. It is infrastructure. Workmen were paid in it. There are strike records from a workers' village where one of the grievances is that the oil ration has not arrived. The rich had it perfumed with lily and myrrh and cinnamon and moringa, and the scent of an Egyptian court was not incense. Primarily, it was warm scented fat, on warm skin, and the cloth. Egyptian linen at the top end is one of the great lost technologies, woven so fine that the surviving pieces are translucent, and you can hold a page behind them, spun from flax by women on horizontal looms. In a country that had no cotton, no silk, and no wool worth having. White, always. Because flax does not take dye well, and because white was the point. In the Amarna art, the queen's gown is drawn as a single sheet of pleated stuff that clings and flows and shows the whole shape of her. And that is not the artist being fanciful. Pleating was done, and the cloth really was that fine. Then the collar. A great broad beaded thing covering the chest from the throat to below the collarbone, made of rows of faience and carnelian and turquoise and gold. Heavy enough that the good ones had a counterweight hanging down the back to stop them tipping forward. Earrings. She has pierced ears on the bust. Bracelets, armlets, anklets, rings. Put it together. A woman with a shaved head, under a blue crown nobody else wore, her eyes ringed in black, her skin oiled and scented, in a sheet of pleated stuff you could nearly see through, under a collar of gold and carnelian, standing in the open, in the full sun of Middle Egypt, with the lights coming down on her. They were not exaggerating. That is what was actually standing there. And then they went out to look for somewhere to put it all. The story of how the city was chosen is on the boundary stele, set down in the king's own voice. And it is precious, because it is the closest we ever get to hearing the man think. He says the Aten showed it to him. He says he found the place, and that it belonged to no god and no goddess, to no ruler and no ruler's wife, to nobody at all, that there was nothing on it and no one had a claim on it. That is the crucial line, and it is almost certainly true. Egypt was old, and after 2,000 years of settlement, almost every scrap of usable land along the river belonged, in some legal and religious sense, to somebody, a god, a temple, a town, a family, an ancestor. To find a genuinely blank stretch of ground the size of a city, with a good harbour on the river and a natural amphitheatre of cliffs behind it, and no history whatsoever, was not easy. He had to go a long way, nearly 200 miles down the river from Thebes, into Middle Egypt, into a place with nothing. And that was the requirement, not the beauty, though it is beautiful, the emptiness. He needed ground with no claim on it, because a city built on somebody's land would carry that somebody's god, and the whole point was to start again. He called it Kitaten, the horizon of the Aten, and then he fixed it in the most literal way anyone has ever fixed a city. He had 14 enormous tablets cut directly into the living rock of the cliffs on both sides of the river, going right round the site, defining the territory, a rounded-topped rectangle, covered in lines of hieroglyphs, with a picture at the top of the royal family worshipping the disk. Most of them had statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, carved out of the rock beside them, with some of their daughters. The enclosed ground measured something like 15 miles across the valley and 8 from north to south, the whole of it. River and desert and farmland and cliff given to the god, you can go and look at them now. Some are badly weathered. Some have been damaged by people trying to cut the figures out of the rock to sell them, but they are there. In the cliffs, 3,500 years later, marking the corners of a city that lasted less than 20 years. There is one thing the stelae are often said to contain which they do not, and since we are being careful tonight, I want to correct it. It is frequently claimed that Akhenaten swore an oath never to leave Akhetaten, that he shut himself inside his own city like a man in a bottle, which makes a marvellous image of a fanatic sealing himself off from the world. That is not what the text says. The oath is about not extending the boundaries. The territory would be this and no more, forever. He plainly expected to travel. The same inscriptions make arrangements for him to be brought back to Akhetaten for burial if he happened to die somewhere else, which is not something you write if you are never going out. The stelae do contain something else, though, and it is very quiet and very sad if you know what happens next. He specifies the graves. His own is to be cut in the cliffs behind the city, and one is to be made there for Nefertiti, and one for Meritete, their eldest daughter. He is a young man in his 20s. He has just found a piece of empty desert. And the first thing he does, before a single wall goes up, is arrange where his wife and his little girl are going to lie. And then he built it. And the speed of it is the thing that stops your breath. Try to hold the scale. From an empty patch of gravel to a functioning capital of somewhere between 20 and 50,000 souls, the estimates vary. And 30,000 is the figure most often used in a handful of years. Not a town. A capital, temples, palaces, a records office, granaries, bakeries, barracks, workshops, villas, streets, a harbour, and a cemetery, every brick of it made on site. That is worth saying, because it is how Egypt built mud from the river, mixed with chopped straw and sand, pressed into a wooden mould, tipped out, left in the sun to bake hard. One man can make a few hundred a day. Akhetaten needed millions upon millions of them, so somewhere in that bay of desert, for years there were fields of bricks laid out to bake beyond counting, and lines of men carrying them, and the smell of wet river mud in a place that had never smelled of anything but hot stone. And the stone, the temples and the palace floors and the columns needed limestone, and it came out of the cliffs behind the city and from quarries up and down the river, including one a few miles north, at a place called Deir Abu Hinis, which I am going to ask you to hold on to, for reasons that will not be clear for a good while yet. Who did the work? Egyptians. Conscripted labour. Mostly the state had always had the right to call men up for a season's work, the way it called them up for the army, and they were fed and housed and paid in bread and beer and cloth. And it was not slavery in the sense people usually mean, and it was also not something any of them chose. There were enslaved people too, in the households and the workshops, and there were skilled men, masons, sculptors, painters, carpenters, who were the aristocracy of labour, and who moved with the court, because that is where the work was. I want to give you the physical fact of it, because we skip past these things, and we should not. Tens of thousands of human beings picked up their lives and moved, on the king's word, to a place with no water supply, no shade, no houses, no farms, and no history. In the middle of the desert, and started again. Officials whose families had been in Thebes for 200 years. Bakers, weavers, doorkeepers, everybody. They went because the court went, and the court was the economy. And if you were not where the king was, you were nowhere. And there was an industry in that city that almost nobody knows about. And it is the loveliest thing they made after the art. They were making glass. Glass in the 14th century before our era was not window glass, and it was not drinking glasses. It was a jewel. It was a manufactured, coloured, precious material, as rare and as valued as lapis or turquoise, and the ability to make it was new in the world, a few centuries old at most. And it belonged to a handful of workshops in the whole of the Near East, and Amarna had one of them. The archaeologists dug the site. It is called 045.1, which is another of those parking space names. And it is a factory. There are the furnaces. There are the crucibles with the glass still stuck in them. There are the failed batches and the trimmings and the waste. And what they were making was colour, deep blue, which was the great prize. Coloured with cobalt, and the cobalt came from oases out in the western desert, hundreds of miles away across the sand. Turquoise, from copper. Purple, from manganese. Green, white. Red, which was fiendishly hard, because it depends on getting the furnace atmosphere exactly right, and the makers cannot have known why it worked, and they were doing something extraordinary with it. They would take rods of different coloured glass and lay them together, and heat them, and draw them out, and slice them, so that a pattern ran all the way through the length of the material, and every slice carried it. That is a technique that Venice was famous for 3,000 years later. They made inlays for furniture. They made beads and rings and amulets by the thousand. They made little vessels, wound round a core of clay, and then trailed with threads of a second colour, and dragged into feathers and zigzags with a point. They made the coloured pieces that go into the collars and the crowns and the eyes of the statues. The blue in the crown of the woman we are talking about was very likely mixed in this city. Alongside it, faience, crushed quartz, mixed to a paste with a little natron and lime, shaped and fired, so that the salts come out to the surface in the heat, and glaze it themselves. Brilliant blue-green, without anybody having to apply a glaze at all. It is a self-glazing ceramic invented in Egypt thousands of years before, and Amarna produced it in industrial quantity. The moulds are there in their hundreds, for beads, for rings, for tiles, for the little figures. Now put that beside everything else, and see what it says about the place. This was a religion of light, and the court that invented it built a factory to make coloured light out of sand, to take the most ordinary material in that country, the stuff the desert is made of, and fuse it in a furnace until it came out blue. The floors of the palace were painted with pools and reeds. The columns were made to look like plants. The walls were inlaid with glass and faience, so that the interiors glittered. Somebody in that city was making a green room where you could sleep inside a marsh. Whatever else this was, it was made by people who were very seriously interested in beauty and who had the resources of the richest state on earth to be interested with. And it all stopped inside 20 years, and the furnaces went cold, and the crucibles sat there with the glass still in them, and the desert came in. And there is a practical question sitting under all of this that nobody in the ancient sources thought worth answering, and the archaeology has had to answer it instead. What did 30,000 people in a desert eat? Because Akhenaten had a problem built into it from the first day. The sacred territory was mostly sand. The good farmland was on the other side of the river. The boundary stele take in a broad tract of it on the west bank, and that was deliberate, because otherwise the city would have starved by the second harvest. So everything had to cross the water. Grain, vegetables, fruit, cattle, fish, wine, oil, wood, everything. Every day. So the harbour was the real heart of the city, not the temple. There were quays along the river, and the boats came in and out constantly. And the whole place ran on a supply chain the way an army does. And that is a fragile arrangement. A capital that grows up over centuries has fields around it, villages that have fed it since anybody can remember, and 100 years of quiet redundancy in the system. A capital that appears in 5 years on empty gravel has none of that. It has a logistics operation, and if the operation falters, 30,000 people are in serious trouble very quickly. There were the granaries, and you can see them on the plan, ranges of them, because the state had always stored against the bad year. There were the fields of the god across the water, and the herds, and the fishing. And there were the people whose entire lives were the moving of it. The boatmen, the donkey drivers, the porters, the ones who carried grain up from the quay in baskets on their shoulders, in that heat, every day of their lives. We know what they were eating, roughly, because of the rubbish and the bones. Bread, and a lot of it, Egyptian teeth, are famously ground down flat by the grit from the querns. And the Amarna dead have that too. Beer, fish from the river, lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, melons and dates and figs. Meat rarely, unless you were somebody, though the workmen kept their pigs. Oil, and there is a detail in the food supply that tells you the whole shape of that society in one line. When the archaeologists worked through the storage areas of the ordinary houses, they found that the households of the officials had granaries, private ones, in their own courtyards, holding enough grain for a year or more. The small houses had nothing of the kind. A worker's family held what it could carry home, so the city ran on a system in which the men at the top could sit out a bad season, in their own backyards, and everybody else was living on the boat that came in this morning. Sit with the two facts together, because they belong together and almost nobody puts them together. The Great Aten Temple had something in the order of 700 offering tables in a single court, and they were piled every day with bread and fruit and meat and beer, in the open, in the sun, for a god who does not eat, and out beyond the walls. The people carrying that food in from the boats were not getting enough of it. I do not think that was cruelty. I do not think anyone in that city thought of it as a choice at all. The offerings fed the priests and the staff afterwards, and the system was the system, and it was no worse than what Egypt had always done. It is simply what happens when you put a capital city in a place with no farms, because a god told you to, and then have to carry every mouthful of its food across a river, forever, on somebody's back. And in a few years, out on that gravel, there was a city, white walls, painted floors, gardens with wells, a road running the length of it, wide enough for chariots, which the archaeologists call the Royal Road, and which is the closest thing the ancient world had to a ceremonial avenue, temples standing open to the sky. And at the centre of it, a family of 8, being watched by everybody all the time, as the entire religious meaning of the country Let me take you into the city itself at about the hour we came in on, and show you what a day in it looked like. The heart of it was the central city, a band of enormous public buildings laid along the river between the residential districts, and the largest thing in it was the Great Aten Temple, which was not a building in any sense we would recognize. It was an enclosure, an immense rectangle, something like half a mile long, standing open to the sky, and inside it, courts, and in the courts, altars. The altars are the detail that undoes people. In one court alone, the archaeologists have traced something in the order of 700 small offering tables, laid out in ranks. And beyond the enclosure, out in the open ground, there were many more again. This was not a religion of a priest slipping into a dark cell with a jug. This was mass provisioning, in the open air, in the glare, on a scale that needed the bakeries and breweries whose foundations still lie beside it, great industrial ranges of ovens, because the god ate bread and the bread had to be baked, in thousands of loaves, every single day, and the offerings were piled up in the light and left there. There is something almost heartbreaking in it. Bread and fruit and flowers and meat and jars of beer, stacked on all of them, in the sun, in a place where the temperature in summer goes past 40 degrees. Egyptologists have wondered dryly what the smell was like by afternoon, and who ate it afterwards, and the answer is almost certainly that the priests and the staff did, and that the gods' leftovers fed a fair slice of the city, which is how temples had always worked, and one of the few things that did not change. Then the palaces. There were several, and they were not castles. Nobody was defending anything. The largest, along the river, was a spread of courts and halls with columns of stone, painted floors, and a hall of pillars so vast that when it was excavated, the diggers could hardly credit the plan. And the North Palace further up seems to have been something quite different and rather wonderful. A residence with a sunken garden court at its heart, with rooms round it painted floor to ceiling, with birds and reeds and water, the famous Green Room, where the painter put a marsh on the walls so that whoever slept there slept inside a riverbank. That palace may have belonged to a woman of the family. It has been argued for Meritaten, the eldest daughter, and for Nefertiti herself. And running between all of it, the length of the city, the road. Wide, straight, and unmistakably designed for one purpose, for the royal family to be seen going along it. Come down off the road for a moment, though, and let me put you in an ordinary house, because we can do that here, and we can do it almost nowhere else in Egypt. A house in the main city, belonging to somebody moderately successful, a scribe, say, or a middling official. It sits in its own walled plot, with a gate off the street. Inside there is a yard, and in the yard there is a well cut down through the gravel to the water, with steps going round it. There are trees, if you can afford the water for them. There is a granary, a round, mud brick bin, like a beehive, up on a little platform. There is a chapel at the end of the garden. There are the animal pens, and the kitchen, which is outside. Because you do not cook inside a mud brick house in that heat, if you can help it. The house itself is low and heavy-walled and cool. You come in through a porch into a hall, and then into the central chamber, which is the heart of it. The largest space, with a raised roof, carried on a few columns and windows, set high up under the ceiling. Small, screened with a stone grille, so that the light comes in as a few white bars and the heat mostly stays out. There is a low bench along one side for sitting. There is a hearth in the middle. The floor is plastered. The plaster is whitewashed, and if you are doing well, painted. Off it are the private spaces. A bedchamber with a raised sleeping platform. A place to dress. And, in a good many of these houses, a bathroom, a stone-lined corner with a lip round it, where a servant poured water over you while you stood on the slab, and it ran out through a channel into a jar. Beside it, a lavatory, a seat with a container of sand underneath. Upstairs there is more of the same, and the roof itself, which is where the family lived half the year, because you sleep on the roof in Egypt in the summer. That is where everybody was at night. Not in the painted chamber. Up on the flat roof, under the sky, in the dark, with the whole city doing the same thing on all the other roofs around them. Think about that for a second. Given everything else in this evening, the god was overhead, all day, insisting on itself. And then it went down, and 30,000 people climbed up onto their roofs and lay under a sky the new religion had not one word to say about, and looked at the stars, which their grandparents had known the names of, and which had now been declared empty. The old religion had the sky full. It had Nut, the goddess whose body was the night, arched over the world with the stars along her belly, swallowing the sun in the evening and giving birth to it at dawn. It had the imperishable ones, the northern stars that never set, which were the souls of the dead who had made it. It had the river of the sky. The Aten's night is simply an absence. The hymn says so, beautifully and coldly, the world in darkness, as if dead, the lion out, the snakes biting, and every eye blind until he rises again. So there they all were, lying on their roofs every night of their lives, under a sky that had been full of meaning for 2,000 years, and had been emptied inside a decade, waiting for the light to come back over the eastern cliffs. And the priests would have told them the darkness meant nothing at all, and I do not for one moment believe that a single one of them looked up and agreed. Because here is the daily machine at the centre of Akhetaten, and it is the strangest court ritual I know of. It was called the Window of Appearances. It was a balcony, essentially, an opening bridging over the road, with a cushioned ledge, where the king and queen and their daughters would stand and be looked at. And beneath it, the court gathered, and from it, on the appointed days, the royal family threw down gold. That is not a figure of speech. The reward of gold was a real institution, heavy collars of golden discs, thrown down from the window to favoured officials standing below, who caught them and put them on and were then carried home shoulder high by their own servants, and who then had the scene carved on the wall of their tomb. That is how we know. We have the tombs of the officials of Amarna cut into the eastern cliffs. And again, what a man chose to have carved above him for eternity was not his family, not his estate, not his deeds. It was the moment the king leaned out over the road and threw him a necklace. Sit with what that tells you about the society. Every good thing came from one place, not from the god. The god was in the sky and did not deal with you, not from a temple, from that ledge. All the wealth, all the status, all the meaning of a man's life came out of that opening, and the men underneath knew it, and they put it in their tombs because it was the most important thing that had ever happened to them. And there, always, is a limb. Not the king alone. The king and Nefertiti side by side, with the small girls leaning over the sill beside them, and above them the disc, letting its rays down onto the two of them, and holding out little hands. That is the theology in a single image. And it is why I keep saying she is not decorative in this. The Aten's rays in that art come down to the king and the queen, not to the officials, not to the crowd, to the pair of them, and through the pair of them, to everybody else. She was not standing next to the god's representative on earth. She was, in the picture, half of it. There was one other woman in that city who mattered, and she was the most experienced political operator in Egypt. And she was Nefertiti's mother-in-law, Tie, the girl from the provinces who married Amenhotep the Magnificent and spent 38 years beside him and made herself indispensable. She had been given honours no Egyptian queen had held before her name in a cartouche. Her figure at her husband's scale, her name in the diplomatic correspondence. Now watch what happened when he died, because it is the thing I find most impressive about her. She did not retire, she did not go quiet. Her husband was dead, her odd second son was on the throne dismantling the religion of the state, and Tai simply carried on being the most important person in the room. There is a letter, it is in the Amarna archive, in the sand at Akhetaten, from the king of Mitanni, written after Amenhotep's death, and it is addressed to her, not to the new pharaoh, to the Queen Mother. And the writer says, plainly, that she knows better than anyone the words her husband exchanged with him, and that the new king should be asked, and that she should be the one to ask him. A foreign monarch, trying to get something out of Egypt, went round the pharaoh and wrote to his mother, because he had correctly identified where the memory and the influence were, and she came to Amarna. There is a scene of her arriving, being brought into the new city by her son, and being shown the sunshade temple he had built for her, a whole structure of her own in the Athens city. She is in the family art. She sits at the dinner. There is a portrait head of her that survives, and it is one of the most extraordinary faces to come out of Egypt. A small, dark, downturned mouth, heavy lids, and an expression of what I can only call absolute, unillusioned intelligence. It is the face of a woman who has seen precisely how everything works and is not going to say so. So there were two of them in that city. The mother-in-law, who had spent 4 decades learning where the power actually sat, and the young queen who was being carved on temple walls as half of a god's light. And nobody wrote down a single word that passed between them, which is a loss I feel more keenly than almost any other in this story. Two of the most powerful women the ancient world produced, in the same small city, in the same family, watching the same young man do the same extraordinary and frightening thing to their country, and we do not have one line. Did TA think it was madness? Did she help? Was she the reason it lasted as long as it did? Nobody knows, and nobody will. She died at Amarna, we think, sometime around the 14th year, in the same stretch of dying that took Nefertiti. Her burial furniture was later dragged back to Thebes when the city was abandoned, and pieces of it were found in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, muddled up with other people's. Because in the panic of the retreat, somebody had to decide what to carry and what to leave. And here is the small, quiet thing about her that I want to leave with you. A lock of Tyre's hair was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, not with her body. In her grandson's grave, in a little nest of coffins, one inside the other, like a child's toy, a curl of an old woman's hair, labelled with her name, put there deliberately by somebody who wanted the boy to have his grandmother with him. That is the only unmistakable act of private affection to survive out of the entire Amarna royal family, and it is not on a temple wall. And nobody was meant to see it, and there were the daughters, and this is the part of the whole Amarna story that stays with people. And I think it is the part she would have recognized as her actual life. There were 6 of them. Meritate and beloved of the Aten, the eldest, who ends up carrying a great deal of weight in the last dark years. Meketaten, the second, who will break your heart before this evening is over. Ankesenpaten, she lives for the Aten. The third, who will change her name and marry a famous boy and become the last of them. Then Nefertiti and the younger, then Nefertiti, then Setepenre. The baby, 6 girls, no sons. And that is a fact with a weight on it, in a country where the throne passed to a son, and it hangs over the whole of the rest of the story. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it is the quiet engine underneath everything that happens to this family. And it is the one part of her life that a great many of the women listening tonight will understand from the inside, without any help from me, understand the arithmetic she was living in. A queen's function. The thing the entire apparatus needed from her was an heir. Everything else, the temple at Karnak, the scale, the mace, the chariot, the rays coming down onto her head, sat on top of that requirement and did not replace it. And year after year she produced a daughter, and another, and another. And the daughters were adored, and were carved on the cliffs, and were given temples of their own, and not one of them could inherit. We have no idea what that was like for her, because nobody wrote it down. But she was married at about 12, and she had 6 children that we know of, in a world where a woman had perhaps a 1 in 50 chance of dying with each one. in a place with no understanding of infection, and every one of those pregnancies was watched by the entire country for the answer to a question, and 6 times the answer was no. And meanwhile, there was another woman in the house, and Kaya's title was the greatly beloved. And somewhere in Amarna there was a little boy, born to a lesser wife, who would be king. Now, I have been careful all night, and I am not going to speculate about her feelings, because we have not got them, and anyone who tells you otherwise is writing fiction. But I will point at the shape of it, because the shape is factual. Here is the most powerful woman Egypt ever produced, shown on the walls doing what only kings did, worshipped as half of a god's own light. And the one thing the system actually wanted from her was the one thing she could not produce. And the boy who would take everything came out of a different room. There is no version of that which is comfortable. It was not comfortable for Kia either, whose things were scratched out and handed on. It was not a competition anybody could win. It was a machine, and it ran on women, and it did not care about any of them. And if that account of the end is right, if she really did put on the crown herself at the last, then look at what she did with it. She had no son to rule through. Every queen before her who had held power had held it as somebody's mother, or somebody's wife, or somebody's regent. She had no such door, so she went through the stort wall instead, and had herself written as a king, with a feminine ending on the epithet, because the language had never needed one before. 6 daughters, and no way in. So she made her own, but look at how they were shown, because it is unlike anything else Egypt ever produced. In the tomb of a courtier at Amarna, there is a scene of the royal family at a meal. The king is eating. He is holding what appears to be a whole roasted bird and biting into it. Nefertiti sits opposite with a cup. The Queen Mother Tia is there. A little princess is on a stool with food in her hand. It is a family having their dinner. For an Egyptian, a monument showing the king with his mouth full is not a small thing. It is a category error. Kings did not eat in stone. There is a fragment where a princess reaches up and turns her mother's chin towards her. There is one where 2 of the small girls sit under their parents' chairs the way children do, taking no notice of the great occasion going on above them. There are painted images of 2 of the youngest sitting on cushions with their arms round each other, and one is picking at the other's earring. That last one is a painted fragment from the palace at Amarna, and it is now in Oxford, and if you have ever seen it, you will not have forgotten it. Because there is nothing else like it in 3,000 years of Egyptian art. It is 2 little girls sitting on the floor being bored. Why did they do it? And here the honest answer is that we do not know, and there are 2 readings, and I hold both. The cold one, it is propaganda, and it is brilliant. The new religion had no myths, it had no stories, no gods with families, no divine dramas, nothing for people to hold on to. So the royal family became the story. Their intimacy was not private, it was the theology on display. Here is the God, here is the light, here is the pair. The light falls on. Here are the children the light produced. The affection is the doctrine. Every kiss in that stone is doing a job. And the warm one, which is not incompatible. They had 6 daughters, they were young. They lived in a house together in the desert with the whole world watching. And when the artists came, this is what they chose to have carved. Nobody made them. Akhenaten could have had himself shown smiting Nubians in a chariot, which is what his ancestors had, and which is what his son-in-law's generation went straight back to. He chose to be shown kissing his little girls. You can call that a strategy. I think that is not quite the whole of it, and I do not think you have to be sentimental to say so. Given absolute power and total freedom over the image of himself and his wife that would stand for eternity, this man commissioned pictures of his family being fond of each other. That is a choice about what mattered. And there is one more piece I want to give you, because it is Nefertiti's, and it is easy to miss. In the hymn to the Aten, the long, magnificent poem carved in the tomb of the courtier A, which is the finest thing this religion produced, and which anyone who knows the Psalms will find eerily familiar. The sun rises, and the world wakes, and the birds lift their wings in praise, and the fish leap in the river, and the child in the egg is given breath, and every land is provided for. It is a genuinely fine poem about light and life, and at the end of it, when the hymn names who the god is known to, it names Akhenaten, and then it names her, the great royal wife, his beloved, the mistress of the two lands, Nefertiti. May she live and be young forever and ever, forever and ever. That is the last line of the most beautiful thing they ever wrote. And her name is in it. There is one more sort of place in that city, which the royal women held in their own names. And it has no equivalent anywhere else in Egypt. A sunshade, the word is almost too pretty for what it was. A sunshade temple, the Egyptian is a shade of Ra, was a structure of its own, with its own courts and its own altars, and its own gardens and its own staff, dedicated to the Aten, and given to a particular woman of the royal family. In her name, Nefertiti had them. So did Meritaten, so did Meketaten, the child who died, so did Ankesenpaiten, so did Kia. So, when she came to the city, did Ta, the queen mother. There were several of them scattered round Akhenaten and out to the north, and they were not small. And here is what makes them peculiar. They were places where the woman herself made the offering. A sunshade was not somewhere she went to watch a priest work. The scenes show her before the altar, doing it, which brings us back to the Halt Ben Ben at Karnak, and tells us that what happened there was not a one-off. It was the pattern. In this religion, the royal women had temples of their own, and in their temples they served the god themselves. Consider what an Egyptian would have made of walking past one. For 2,000 years there had been exactly one route to the divine, and it ran through the king. And the queen's role in it was to stand behind him and shake a sistrum. And now here is a walled garden in the sunlight, with an altar in it and a woman's name over the gate. And they were gardens. That is the other thing. The excavated ones have planting pits trees set out in rows, and beds, and basins, and water brought to them in the desert, at what must have been an eye-watering cost in labour. There was a place called the Marua Ten at the southern end of the city, with an artificial lake and an island in it, and pavements of painted plaster, showing marshes and birds and fish, and little kiosks and pools and flower beds. It was made for a woman. Its name was originally Kia's, and after she died, her name was cut out of it, and Meritaten's put in. So picture it. The hottest, driest, emptiest ground in Egypt. And somebody has dug a lake in it, and planted trees round it, and painted the floors to look like water, and set an altar in the middle, and given the whole thing to a woman so that she could stand in the light and make the offering herself. That is the thing about Akhenaten. I keep having to hold alongside the bones in the cemetery, and I cannot make the two of them agree, and I have decided that is honest rather than a failure. The same regime that was working teenagers to death on the building sites was digging ornamental lakes so that its women could worship in the shade of imported trees. Both are true. Both are the same 20 years, and every one of those gardens is gone now. The trees, the water, the paint, the names, the planting pits are still there in the sand. That is all. Rows of holes in the desert where somebody grew a grove for a queen, and the archaeologists can tell you the spacing. Come up into the cliffs with me now, though, because the men who served them cut their graves into that rock, and what they chose to carve inside is the strangest confession the ancient world has left us. There are about 24 of them. Up in the eastern hills, north and south of the city, the tombs of the great officials of Akhenaten, the chief of police, the chamberlain, the steward, the high priest of the Aten, the overseer of the harem, I, the courtier, who has the largest and finest of them all. Now, an Egyptian nobleman's tomb had always had one purpose, and it was blunt self-interest. The walls were covered with the things you wanted to have forever. Your estate, your cattle, your fields being harvested, your wife beside you, your children, your servants bringing you dinner, you hunting birds in the marshes with a throwing stick. The tomb was a machine for keeping your life going after you had stopped. And every image in it was there for you. Go into the tombs at Amarna, and the owner is barely in them. The walls are covered with the royal family. Enormous scenes of the king and the queen and the daughters. At the window, in the chariot, at the temple, at dinner, in the palace. The tomb's owner is a small figure at the edge, bowing or being thrown a necklace, or standing among a crowd of courtiers with his arms up. In some of them, you have to hunt for him. That is a man decorating his own eternity with pictures of somebody else's family. And the more you sit with it, the colder it gets. It is not devotion, or not only. Remember the new theology. The dead do not go to Osiris anymore, because Osiris has been abolished. What the dead do at Amarna is wake with the sun and go to the temple for their offerings. So your entire afterlife now depends on the Athens cult continuing, which depends on the king. He is not merely the source of your career, he is the source of your resurrection. Put his face on your wall. Or there is no mourning. Every one of those tombs is a man doing the only thing that will work, in a system where the god has been made unreachable, and the king is the only door. And in the greatest of them, in Ai's tomb, they carved the poem. The great hymn to the Aten is the finest thing this religion made. It is long, it is genuinely beautiful, and it is, on any honest assessment, one of the great religious poems. It describes the night the world in darkness, the earth in silence, the lion out of its cave, the snakes biting, and every house shut, and the sleepers lying with their heads covered, and not one eye seeing another. It describes the dawn, the land brightening, the two lands in festival, everybody waking and washing and dressing and lifting their arms, the herds content in their pasture, the trees and the plants growing green, the birds flying up out of the marsh with their wings raised in praise. It describes the chick in the egg, speaking inside the shell, and the god giving it breath so that it can come out and walk on its legs. It describes the child in the woman's body, and the god soothing it so that it does not cry. And then it goes outside Egypt, and this is the part that catches at people, because no Egyptian text had ever really done it. He made Syria, it says, and Nubia, and the land of Egypt. He sets everyone in his place. Their tongues are different, and their skins are different, because he made them so. He puts a Nile in the sky for the foreign countries, so that it rains on their mountains and waters their fields, since they have no river of their own, a rain Nile in the sky for foreigners. That is a god who is not Egypt's god. That is a poem written 33 centuries ago in the most self-satisfied civilization on earth, saying that the light falls on everybody. Anyone who knows the 104th Psalm will have been feeling something for the last minute. The resemblances are real. The darkness and the lion, the young ones seeking their food from God, the sun rising and man going out to his work. Whether there is any connection is one of the oldest arguments in the field, and the honest answer is that nobody can show a line of transmission across the centuries that separate them. And the similarity may simply be that two cultures in the same corner of the world, looking at the same sun coming up over the same kind of country, said similar things. That is not a lesser explanation. It might be a better one, and at the end of the hymn, after the chick and the child and the rain in the sky, it names who knows the god. It names Akhenaten, and then it names her and asks that she may live and be young forever and ever. That is what is carved in the tomb of the man who was probably her father, and who would end his life marrying her daughter to take the crown. Now let me take you out to the edge of the city, because there was another Amarna, and it is the one that tells you the truth. About a mile out into the desert behind the city, up a little valley, there is a walled village. It is small, about 70 dwellings, packed tight in a grid inside a square enclosure. all of them almost identical, each a narrow strip about 5 meters by 10. This was the workmen's village, where the men who cut the royal tombs lived with their families, kept apart from the city and provisioned by the state, exactly as the tomb cutters at Thebes were kept apart across the river. It is one of the most valuable places in the world for anyone who wants to know how the ancient poor actually lived, because none of it was swept away or built over. It was abandoned when the city was, and it lay there, and here is what was inside. Bes, the little dwarf god with the lion's mane and the stuck-out tongue, who guarded women in childbirth and frightened away bad things in the night. Tauret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, standing upright, who protected mothers. Household shrines, amulets. Figures of the old gods in the niches, under the floors, in the houses of the very men who were cutting the tombs of the king who had abolished them. They never converted. I want to let that sit, because it is the single most important fact in this whole story, and it almost never gets told. The Aten religion, for all its beauty and all its ferocity, reached the palace and the officials and the walls of the temples, and it never got into the homes of the men who built it. A mile from the temple with its 700 altars, ordinary Egyptians went on putting a hippopotamus goddess in the wall to look after their wives in labour, because a sun disk that only speaks to the king is no use to a woman in a mud brick room at midnight who is frightened and in pain. You cannot make people stop needing what they need. The king could take Amun's name off monuments of Egypt. And he did, and he could not take bears out of a workman's bedroom, and they had chapels. Up on the slope above it, the men put together small chapels out of the rubble, with their own hands, on their own time, and in them they made offerings to their own dead and to the gods they had grown up with. Nobody made them do that. Nobody was watching. That is not a state religion. That is what people do when they are left alone. There is another detail from that village that I find almost unbearably ordinary and human. They kept pigs. The archaeologists found the pens and the bones and worked out that the families were running a proper little pork industry up there, raising pigs, salting the meat, and almost certainly trading it. They were given rations by the state, and the rations were not enough or were not what they wanted. And so they built themselves a side business in bacon, in the desert behind the holy city of the sun. That is the sound of real lives. Not the hymn, not the window. 70 families in a walled square, a mile out in the sand, worshipping the wrong gods in their bedrooms and selling pork to each other. And there is a reason those men kept the old gods in their bedrooms that goes far deeper than habit, and it is the cruelest thing about the whole beautiful religion. And it is almost never mentioned. Akhenaten took away the afterlife. To feel what that means, you have to understand what the Egyptians had. No people who have ever lived put more thought, more money, more labour, or more love into what happens after you die. The whole civilization is organised around it. They spent 70 days preparing a body so that it would last. They filled the grave with bread and beer and furniture and games and little servant figures who would do your work for you in the next world, so that eternity would be comfortable. They wrote out spells and put them in the coffin with you, so that you would know the answers when you were asked. And at the centre of it stood Osiris, the god who had been murdered by his brother, and cut apart and put back together by his wife and sister Isis, who gathered the pieces of her husband, and made the first mummy, and brought him back, and who therefore ruled that country himself, because he had been there. That was the promise. You die, and you go west with the sun, and you are judged. Your heart is set on a balance against a feather, and if you have lived rightly, it does not weigh more, and you pass, and you live forever in a country like Egypt, but better, with fields and a river and no hunger. That was available to anybody. That is the thing to hold. It was expensive to do it properly, and the rich did it magnificently. But the promise itself was not the king's private property. A weaver could hope for it. A brickmaker could hope for it. A woman who died in childbirth could hope to see her mother again in a green country. For 2,000 years, everybody in Egypt died into that, and Akhenaten's religion had none of it. No Osiris. He is gone, not argued with, simply absent from the new theology entirely. No judgment of the heart, no underworld, no night journey, no boat, no fields of reeds, no spells. The funerary texts stop. Even the little servant figures change their nature. What is offered instead is this: you sleep at night in your tomb. And in the morning, when the sun comes up over the eastern cliffs, they wake and they get up and they come out and they go into the temple in the city and receive their offerings there in the light. And when the sun goes down again, they go back and sleep. That is the afterlife of Akhenaten. You wake with the sun, you go to the temple, you go back to bed. Forever. Look at what has been done there. It is not nothing, it is beautiful in its own austere way. And it fits the logic of a religion in which light is everything and the dark is simply the absence of God. But it is bounded entirely by that city. Your eternity is a commute. You do not go anywhere. You do not meet anyone. There is no reunion, no green country, no reward, and crucially, there is no judgment, which sounds like a mercy and is not, because judgment is what made the promise mean something. And the whole arrangement depends on being buried at Amarna, within reach of the temple. In the shadow of the cliffs, the sun comes over. So what happens to the people whose parents are buried at Thebes? That is the question I cannot get out of my head, and it is the real cost of this revolution. And it is not on any monument. Every family who moved to that city left their own behind. In the old religion they needed you. You brought them offerings, you said their names, and the saying of the name was what kept them going. And now the entire court had moved 200 miles down the river, to a city where those older graves had no standing and no route home. And where whoever died here would rise each morning to a temple. The next king was going to close. I think that is why there is a hippopotamus goddess in the wall of a workman's house a mile from the Great Aten temple. It is not superstition, and it is not stupidity, and it is not even really rebellion. It is a man with a wife who might die tonight in childbirth, in a religion that had nothing to say to her, keeping the God who did. And the bones of those people tell the rest of it, and it is the part of Amarna nobody puts on a postcard. The city has cemeteries, not the grand rock tombs of the officials in the cliffs. Those we have known about for a century. The other ones, the common graves out in the desert, which have been excavated in our own time and which have changed the way everybody thinks about this place. The results are grim, and they are the necessary corrective to everything I have just shown you. Those buried there died young. A great many of them died as children and teenagers. The age profile of the dead is heavily weighted to the young in a way that is abnormal, even by ancient standards. The adults show the marks of very hard physical labour, and they show it early: spines damaged and compressed, joints worn out, muscle attachments overdeveloped from carrying, and injuries, broken bones, at a rate that speaks of accidents on building sites. And there are signs of malnutrition and of stunted growth. The inhabitants of the Sun City were, on average, shorter than Egyptians elsewhere. They were not being fed well enough for the work they were doing. Their graves are poor: a pit in the sand, a mat, a stick coffin if you were lucky, a couple of pots. Some of them were buried several to a pit. Almost nothing was in them. So hold the two pictures together, because that is the only honest way to carry this city, up on the carved stone, light and hands coming down out of the sky, and a family kissing and grain bending in the wind, and a hymn about the child in the egg being given breath, and the God who provides for every land without partiality. Out in the sand, a 15-year-old with a crushed spine. Akhenaten was built at enormous speed by human muscle, out of nothing, in a place with no farms and no infrastructure, and everything had to be hauled in. And somebody hauled it. The bodies in those cemeteries are the receipt, and the most beautiful religious poem of the ancient world was being carved on the cliffs above them while it happened. I am not telling you that to spoil the picture. I am telling you because the picture is not true without it, and because they were as real as the Queen was, and nobody carved their faces. And there is the eldest, who has been standing at the edge of this all evening, and who deserves her own minute. Because she is the one who had to hold the roof up. Meritatan, beloved of the Aten. The first child, she is the one who is there from the beginning. She is in the Karnak blocks as a baby, before the city existed. Standing beside her mother in the temple where her mother offered alone, she is on the boundary stele in the cliffs, carved out of the rock with her parents, when she was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, and the city was a plan. She is on the wall of the tomb, where they buried her sister. She was named, in her father's own foundation text, as one of the 3 people who would be buried in the eastern hills, him, her mother, and her, and then, in the last years, everything lands on her. Her sisters die or vanish. Kea's possessions are recut with her name on them. She appears as great royal wife when her mother stops being called it. She is married to Smenkhare, the co-regent, and is his queen. And then he dies too. She turns up in the diplomatic correspondence. There is a letter from a foreign king that mentions her by name, which means that whoever was running Egypt's foreign policy at the end, she was somebody a great power had heard of. Try to hold her life in order. She was born into the strangest experiment in the ancient world and grew up as an object of public worship, literally, in the sense that her image was on temple walls, being shone on by a god. She watched her father abolish everything. She watched her family move into the desert. She was carved on a cliff at 4. She lost a sister at 12 or so, and her parents were carved bent over the body. She lost the other 3. She was married to a king who died. She stood in as queen for her own mother, and she is the eldest daughter of the most famous woman in the world. And we do not know how old she was when she died, or what she died of, or where she is. She simply stops, like all of them. And here is the small thing that I cannot let go of. There is a painted fragment from the palace at Amarna, 2 little girls on a cushion with their arms round each other, one of them fiddling with the other's earring. It is not certain which daughters they are. And in the same painting, damaged now, there were more of them, and their mother and a bigger girl sitting apart. Somebody in that palace commissioned a painting of the children being bored on the floor and put it on a wall in a private room, and it survived because the city was abandoned and nobody thought it worth carrying away. That is the only picture we have of what it was actually like to be one of them. And it is a picture of nothing happening on a warm afternoon, and every single person in it came to a bad end. There was another wife, and she is almost never mentioned, and her story is the darkest small thing at Amarna. Her name was Kea. We know very little. She was not the great royal wife that was Nefertiti, always. Kea held a different title, and it is a strange one, unique to her, and it repays saying in full, because somebody weighed it out on purpose, the greatly beloved wife of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Akhenaten. Not the great wife, the greatly beloved one. She had her own sunshade temple. She had her own suite of vessels and furniture, with her name on them, made to a high standard. She is shown with a daughter. Some Egyptologists have argued she may have been the Mitanni princess Tadukipa, after all, the foreign bride sent to Amenhotep III and inherited by his son, which would be a neat solution to 2 puzzles at once, and which cannot be proved. And then, at some point in the last years, everything of hers was taken and given to somebody else. That is the part that stops me. Her name was chiselled out of her own possessions and replaced with Meritaten's, mostly the eldest daughter, and in places with Ankhesenpaitan's. Her sunshade temple was reassigned. Her canopic jars, the vessels made to hold her organs for eternity, were altered and used for another burial entirely. They very probably ended up in the muddled cache in the Valley of the Kings, holding another woman altogether. Her face on the coffin was recut. Even the little figure of her daughter was changed into a different child. Someone went through the possessions of a dead woman and reissued them. Now, for a long time this was hung on Nefertiti, and you can see the appeal, the jealous queen, the rival removed, the erasure as revenge. It made a wonderful story, and it was told alongside the other wonderful story, the one about Nefertiti vanishing in year 12, a queen who destroys her rival and is then destroyed herself. But the evidence does not really support it, and the dates make it awkward, and there is a simpler and colder explanation. Kia's things were not erased out of spite. They were recycled. She died, and a royal burial's worth of extremely expensive, already made, already consecrated equipment was sitting there, and the court was in the middle of a run of deaths and needed funerary goods faster than the workshops could make them. And so her name was scratched off, and the name of whoever needed burying next was put in. It is not hatred. It is worse than hatred. It is administration, and that tells you something true about that place in its last years, that no wall painting will. Amarna was burying people quickly. It was reusing coffins. The city that had promised everybody they would wake with the sun every morning, forever was going through its dead so fast that it was recutting the jars. Nobody knows where Kia is either. Now let me put together what she actually was. Because scattered across those walls is a body of evidence about a queen that has no parallel in Egyptian history, and when you assemble it, it is startling. Start with size, because in Egyptian art size is not aesthetics, it is grammar. Scale states rank. A king is large, his officials are small, his wife is medium. That is not a stylistic habit, it is a statement of fact carved into the stone. And any Egyptian could take it in at a glance. Nefertiti stands at her husband's scale. Constantly. Not occasionally. Not in one flattering monument as the standard. Then the acts. She makes the offering to the Aten, with no king present, which we have already seen at Karnak, and which was, on its own, unprecedented. She drives a chariot herself, holding the reins, which is a king's image and a soldier's image, and not a queen's. She appears in the boat. She leans out over the road, handing down the collars of gold, which is the distribution of the king's own favour. And on the boundary stele, out on the cliffs, there are statues of her standing beside him, cut from the living rock, at the corners of the sacred land. And then there is the one that stops everybody, and it is on a block from a temple at Amarna that is now in Boston. She is on the royal barge. She has one hand raised, holding a mace, and in the other hand she has a captive by the hair, kneeling, and she is about to strike. That is the smiting scene. It is the single oldest and most rigidly reserved image in Egyptian art. It goes back to the very beginning, to the palette of Narmer at the dawn of the whole civilization, some 17 centuries before her. The king, mace raised, enemy by the hair. It appears on temple gateways the length of the country. It means one thing and one only. This is the king, and the king destroys the enemies of order. And that is what a king is. It is not a record of an event. It is a definition, and there she is doing it. A woman on a monument in the king's own gesture. Now I have to be honest about the difficulty of interpreting it, because I have been careful all night, and I am not going to stop here. There are scholars who caution that we may be making too much of it, that Amarna simply produced far more royal imagery than any other site. So we may just be seeing better evidence rather than exceptional behaviour, and that other queens might have done more than we know if their monuments had survived. That is a fair point, and it deserves saying. But it does not really cover the smiting block, and it does not cover an entire temple where she officiates, and he is absent. At some stage, the accumulation stops being a sampling error and starts being a fact. So what was she? And here I think the honest answer is that Egypt did not have a word for it. And neither do we, She was not a queen consort in the ordinary sense that role existed. It was well defined. And this is not it. She was not a queen regnant either. Not at this stage. He was alive and reigning, and she is not called king. She is something the system had no slot for, a co-worshipper. In a religion whose entire content was the relationship between the son and the royal couple, she was half of the couple, and therefore half of the religion. The rays come down to two people. There is no version of the Aten faith with only one of them in it, and that, I suspect, is the whole explanation of her power. And it is also the trap in it. It was not constitutional. She held no office. Egypt did not have offices for women. Her position was theological. She was necessary because the doctrine needed a pair. And a theology is only as durable as the man who invented it. Meanwhile, out beyond the cliffs, an empire was going quietly wrong. We know this in remarkable detail because of an accident, and the accident is one of the best things that ever happened to ancient history. In the late 1800s, a woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of Amarna, the mud brick of ancient towns rots down into good soil, and Egyptian villagers dug it out by the ton, turned up some clay tablets. They were sold and dismissed as fakes. And eventually somebody recognized what they were. They were the foreign ministry. Nearly 400 tablets, the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian crown in Akkadian, which was the international language of the age, dispatches from the rulers of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni and the Hittites, and from the vassal cities up and down the coast of Canaan and Syria. It is the earliest large body of international diplomacy that survives anywhere in the world. And it had been lying in a records room in the sand at Akhetaten. And what do they say? Two things, mostly. The great powers write to Egypt as equals and ask for gold, endlessly, with the most wonderful mixture of flattery and complaint. My brother, they begin because kings addressed each other as brothers. And then, my brother, let gold come, for in your land it is as plentiful as dust. And in the next dispatch, the gold you sent was not pure. I put it in the fire, and there was hardly anything of it. And elsewhere, why have you not asked after my health? One foreign monarch is deeply offended that the Egyptian messengers kept his own envoy waiting. These are not the communications of an empire in crisis. They are the ordinary, faintly comic grievances of an international system that is functioning. But the rest are different, and they come from the vassals, and they get worse as the years go on. The little rulers of the Levantine cities write with increasing desperation, the lands are being lost, a neighbour has turned. Let archers come, 50 men, 20 men, and please, my lord, my son, my God, answer me. There is one man in Byblos called Rib Hadda, who wrote more than 60 times, each appeal more frantic than the last, watching his city being squeezed, begging for help, and getting nothing. It is one of the saddest sequences in ancient literature, and you can watch a man's world close in on him, dispatch by dispatch. Now the old story is that Akhenaten was so lost in his God that the empire fell apart while he prayed, and this is the standard indictment, and it needs a caution. Modern scholarship is a good deal less sure. Vassals always exaggerate. That is what vassals do. And every one of those letters is a man trying to get resources out of a distant government by making his situation sound dire. Egypt did dispatch troops sometimes. Some of the loss of the northern territories was down to the rise of the Hittites, which was a genuine great power shift, and not something a more attentive pharaoh would have simply prevented. And the empire did not collapse. It was still there when he died. But the impression that remains, after all the caveats, is of a government looking inward. The dispatches arrived in a city built to face the sun, and were filed, and a good many of them do not seem to have been answered. And then came the 12th year, and it was the summit of everything. And it is the last unambiguously happy thing in this story. It is carved in two of the officials' tombs, and it is one of the great set pieces of Egyptian art. The king and the queen are carried out in state, on a shared palanquin with the 6 daughters, and they are set down in the open under a canopy, and before them the world files past. Everything comes in, rings and ingots stacked up, silver, chariots, horses, weapons, bows, ostrich feathers and eggs, ebony, ivory, leopards. There are people from the south, from Nubia and Kush, and people from the north, from Syria and the coast, and from the islands, and from Libya, all bringing tribute and gifts in their own dress, drawn with real attention to the difference in their clothes and their hair. There are lions on leashes. There is a giraffe, and the family sits and watches the world come to them. It is dated precisely year 12, the 2nd month of winter, day 8, and it is the high water mark. The city is finished. The religion is established. The empire is sending its tribute. The king is in his 30s. The queen is in her 30s. The 6 girls are all alive and all there. The youngest of them still tiny, and everybody is in the picture. I want you to hold that scene for a moment, with the canopy and the tribute and the leopards and the giraffe and the 6 girls and the 2 of them together on the same seat. Because it is the last time we see them all together. Everything after this is loss. The first of them was Nefertiti, the 2nd daughter, and there is a wall for her. And it is one of the most extraordinary things ever carved in Egypt. In the royal tomb, cut into the eastern hills exactly where the boundary stele said it would be, there is a suite of chambers off the main corridor. They were made for her, and on their walls there is a scene of a death. She lies on a bier in a small room, and standing in front of her are her mother and her father, and they are grieving. That is the sentence I need you to feel the weight of. In 3,000 years of Egyptian monumental art, kings do not grieve. Nobody grieves. Egyptian funerary art is about the successful transition of the dead into eternity. It is confident, formal, and it does not admit that anything has gone wrong, because admitting that would be to give it power. There are mourners in Egyptian tombs, professional ones, women with their arms up and dust in their hair, doing the ritual. That is not the same at all. That is a performance of grief, correctly executed. This is different. The king and queen are standing at the bed of their dead child, and the artist has drawn them bent and clutching at each other, and the king's arm is raised. And behind them, the courtiers are shown, collapsed and weeping, and beside them are the surviving sisters, small, watching their parents come apart. Nobody had ever put that on a wall. Nobody ever put it on a wall again. She was perhaps 11 or 12. We do not know what she died of. She is mentioned for the last time around the 13th or 14th year, which is to say within a year or 2 of the great parade with the giraffe. And then that room was cut for her in the rock, and the surrounding rooms in that tomb show more of it. There appears to be a second death scene of another woman, with a baby being carried away by a nurse. And the arguments about who she is have gone on for decades. Some take her for another daughter, some for Kia, the king's other wife. What is not in doubt is that the royal tomb at Amarna holds not one, but several scenes of the family standing over their dead, which is an astonishing subject for a mausoleum to be full of, and there is a thread running underneath it that the archaeology has made much stronger in recent years. There may have been plague at Amarna. Something was moving through the Near East in these decades. The Hittite records speak of a pestilence that came into their country with Egyptian prisoners and killed their king and his heir, and it ran for 20 years. Amarna's cemeteries are heavy with the young. Several members of the royal family and several of the great officials seem to disappear at about the same moment. It is not proven, and it may never be, but a city crammed with people, badly fed, in the heat, at the end of a long supply line, is exactly where a thing like that would take hold. Whatever it was, this is the point at which the sunlit family in the pictures stops. 4 of the 6 daughters vanish from the record around here. Nefertiti and Setapenre and Nefertiti and the younger are simply not mentioned again. And after year 12, You can almost feel the walls of that city changing temperature. And it is at exactly this moment, in the middle of the dying, that the story is supposed to lose her. Here is the account you have probably heard, and it is in a great many books, and it is on a great many documentaries, and it is wrong. It goes like this. In the 12th year of the reign, at the very summit, the tribute, the canopy, the giraffe, the 6 daughters. Nefertiti vanishes. She is never mentioned again. She is not in the later scenes. Her name stops, and nobody knows what happened. She died, or she was disgraced and thrown out, or she fell from favour, or she was murdered, or she left. The most famous woman in Egypt simply evaporates at the height of her power, and the silence has never been explained. It is a wonderful piece of theatre. It has been told for the best part of a century. Whole theories have been built on it. The fall from grace, the exile to the North Palace, the queen supplanted by a younger woman, the marriage that turned to ash while the world watched. You will find all of it in print, written by serious people, and repeated everywhere. And in the year 2012, a Belgian team working a few miles north of the city put an end to it. They were in the limestone quarries at a place called Deir Abu Hinis, the quarries that had been cut to build Akhenaten in the first place, the ones I asked you to hold on to. And in one of them, Quarry 320, on the rock there was an inscription that nobody had properly recorded, a building text, the kind of thing a work gang scratches up to date and dedicate a job, the ancient equivalent of a foreman writing on a beam, and it is dated, year 16, the 3rd month of the season of Akhet, day 15, and it names her, alive, the great royal wife, his beloved Nefertiti. Take a moment with what that does, because it is not a footnote, it is a demolition. Year 16. Akhenaten dies in his 17th year. That inscription puts Nefertiti alive, at her husband's side, holding the title she had always held, Great Royal Wife, the highest a woman could carry. Approximately 1 year before the end of the reign, she did not vanish in year 12. She was never anywhere else. She was there almost to the last. And this is the reason I wanted to tell you her story tonight. Out of all the ancient women I could have chosen. Because the famous puzzle, the beautiful, romantic, endlessly retold puzzle of the queen who disappeared at the height of her glory, was not about her at all. It was a hole in our own evidence. For 100 years we mistook the edges of what we happened to have dug up for the edges of a woman's life. And we built her a whole tragic third act, out of our own ignorance, and we told it with total confidence. And then one afternoon, somebody looked properly at a wall in a quarry, and the tragic third act simply went away. That happens more than anybody likes to admit. Most of what we say about the ancient world is a description of our evidence, pretending to be a description of the past. So what actually happened after year 12? Something did change. And it is worth being precise about what. What we see after year 12 is that Nefertiti stops appearing under that name in some of the contexts where she used to. Meritaten, the eldest daughter, becomes much more prominent and takes on the role of great royal wife in some scenes, which was startling and was one of the props of the disgrace theory. And a figure appears alongside Akhenaten, who is a co-regent, a second king, sharing the reign, and then there is the name Nefertiti. Follow this carefully, because it is the whole puzzle. That word was already part of her own name. She had been Nefertiti since the 5th year of the reign, and in the last years it turns up on its own, as a royal name, a king's name, in a cartouche, and here is the detail that gives it away. And it is one of the loveliest pieces of evidence in Egyptology, because it is grammatical. Some of the epithets attached to this ruler are written with feminine endings. Beneficial for her husband, desired of Wainre being one of Akhenaten's own names. Effective for her husband, that is a king's cartouche with a wife inside it. So the case runs like this. At some point near the end, She was elevated. Not set aside, elevated. She stopped being the great royal wife in those scenes, not because she had been thrown out, but because she had been promoted past it into a co-regency. And a co-regent is not shown as a wife. A co-regent is shown as a king. Which would also explain Meritatan, stepping up. If your mother has become a king, somebody has to be queen, and the eldest daughter takes the title, and that is consistent with the year 16 Quarry text, where she is still great royal wife, which would date her elevation to the very last stretch, or would mean the two titles overlapped in different contexts. Then Akhenaten died, in his 17th year, and somebody ruled Egypt for a short time who was, on the evidence, a woman. I have to hand you the honest state of it now, because this is the live edge of the field, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. There was also a figure called Smenkhare, who is a king in the last years, and who is a separate person on the current best evidence. An earlier co-regent, probably male, married to Meritatan, and who seems to have died before the female king took the throne. For a long time, people tried to make Smenkhare and Nefertiti the same person. That has largely fallen away. So the sequence most specialists would now sketch with a great deal of hedging, and it may be overturned by the next thing somebody digs up runs. Akhenaten, with Smenkhare as co-regent. Smenkhare dies. Nefertiti is raised beside him under the throne name Nefertiti. Akhenaten dies. She reigns alone for perhaps 2 or 3 years, and then a small boy becomes king. If that is right, then the woman we started with, the girl of about 12 of unknown parents, married to a spare prince, ended her life as pharaoh of Egypt in her own right. Not queen, not consort, king. In a country that had a word for king, and no word for a woman who was one, which is why they wrote it with a feminine ending and left us the clue. And there is one more piece, and it is the strangest document to survive from the whole ancient world, and it may be her. It is in the royal archives of the Hittites. Hundreds of miles away in what is now Turkey, a letter came to their king from the widowed queen of Egypt. It says, more or less, "My husband is dead, and I have no son. You have many sons. Send me one of yours, and I will make him my husband. For I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband." I am afraid he could not believe it. He sent a man down to check, because it was too good and too strange. The throne of Egypt, offered to a foreign prince by the queen herself. And the messenger came back and said it was true. So he sent a son, and the young man set out, and he was murdered on the road, and he never arrived. And his father went to war over it. Who wrote that letter? The queen is called Dahamunzu, which is not a name. It is the Hittite scribe writing down the Egyptian phrase for the king's wife and thinking it was a name, which is the sort of accident that makes historians laugh. The dead husband is given as Nibiruria, and the argument over which pharaoh that is has run for a century. If it is Tutankhamun, then the letter is from Ankhesenamun, his widow, Nefertiti's third daughter, aged about 20 and utterly alone. If it is Akhenaten, then it is from Nefertiti. Most people now lean to Ankhesenamun, but nobody can shut the door. And either way, whichever of them it was, sit with the situation the letter describes. A woman is running Egypt. Her husband is dead. There is no son. And she understands exactly what is going to happen to her. Some man of the court, some official, some commander, is going to marry her and take the throne through her, because that is how it works, and she has watched it work. And rather than allow that, she writes to a foreign enemy king and offers to import a stranger who does not speak her language, because a foreigner she chose is better than a servant who takes her. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. That is one of the very few sentences from the ancient world in which you can hear a woman's actual voice, making an actual decision. And it is a sentence about refusing to be handed to somebody. And it failed. The boy was killed on the way, and no Hittite ever sat on the throne of Egypt. And the woman who wrote that letter got exactly the outcome she had written it to prevent. And then the whole thing finished, and it finished quickly, and it finished with a child. Akhenaten died in his 17th year, at about 40. We do not know how. He was buried, it seems, in the royal tomb up the wadi, in the rock he had set aside for himself before there was a city to be buried from. Then that female king, whoever she was, ruled briefly. And then the throne went to a boy of about 9, whose name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. He was almost certainly Akhenaten's son by a lesser wife, and he was married, at 9 or so, to Ankhesenpaten, who was his half-sister and was a few years older. And the 2 children were put on the throne of the largest empire on earth. Nobody imagines they decided anything. Behind them stood the men who had been standing behind Akhenaten all along, the courtier and a soldier called Horemheb, who commanded the army. And those 2 men now made the decision that closed the whole experiment. They went home. In the boy's 3rd year, the names changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. Ankhesenpaten became Ankhesenamun. The sun disk was out of their names, and the hidden one was back in, and a boy of 11 or 12 had signed his father's life's work away, because the adults told him to, and then the court simply left. The government moved back north to Memphis, and the religion moved back to Thebes, and the temples of Amun that had been shut were reopened and refunded, and we have the boy's own account of it on a stone slab called the Restoration Stela, in which he describes the state of Egypt under his father in terms that are frankly astonishing. The temples were fallen into ruin, he says. The land was in chaos. The gods had turned their backs on this country. If you prayed to a god, he did not come. That is a son describing his father's reign. And whatever you make of the politics of it, it is a boy being handed a text and told to sign the destruction of his own family. And Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun. The city built on empty ground, the boundary stelae, the 700 altars, the palaces with painted floors, the green room with its birds, was left, not destroyed. Left. Everyone went. The officials went, because the court went. The workmen went. The bakers and the weavers and the doorkeepers went. Within a very few years there was nobody living in what had been, 20 years before, the capital of the world, and the desert began coming back over the streets, and the mud brick began to melt in the rare rains, and the wind put the sand back where the sand had been 20 years. That is the whole life of the city. It was founded, it was filled with 30,000 people. It produced the most beautiful art Egypt ever made and the most extraordinary religious poetry of the ancient Near East. And it was empty again inside a single human lifetime. A woman who was a young mother when the first bricks were laid could have walked through those streets in her old age, with nobody in them, and that is where she is lost. Somewhere in those last years, between the quarry inscription and the empty city, Nefertiti stops. And we do not have her death, and we do not have her tomb, and we do not have her body. Before we leave them, let me finish the daughter, because she is the last of that family, and she lived long enough to see all of it undone. Ankhesenpaten. The 3rd girl. She is the one on the cushion in the palace painting, or she is one of the small ones at her mother's knee. In all those scenes of the family in the light. She was married at about 12 or 13 to her half-brother, a boy of 9, and the 2 children were set on the throne, and whatever they were to each other. We have one object that has never stopped bothering anybody who has seen it. On the back of the golden throne from Tutankhamun's tomb, the great one, gold and silver, and coloured glass, there is a scene of the 2 of them. He is sitting, she is standing in front of him, leaning in, and she is putting oil on his shoulder with one hand, and above them, still, the disk of the Aten, with the rays coming down. The throne was made in the Amarna style, in the old faith, for 2 children who would spend the rest of their short lives dismantling it. They had 2 daughters. Neither lived. Both were born too early, and both were embalmed with the whole of the state's skill and put into little gold coffins, one inside the other, and they were found in his tomb in a plain wooden box, set next to one another. That is the end of Nefertiti's line, 2 babies in a box, in their father's grave. He died at about 19, and then his widow, aged perhaps 21, was the last of the blood, and the crown ran through her. And she knew exactly what that meant, that whichever man of the court took her would be king. And that, most people now think, is when the letter went north to the Hittites. She is the likelier author of it than her mother ever was. No son, no brother, no protector, and a perfectly clear view of what was coming for her. It failed, as we have seen. And then A married her, the old courtier of 70 or so, very probably her own grandfather, who put on the crown of Egypt and reigned 4 years. There is a ring carrying their 2 names together, which is how we know it happened at all. Think about what that marriage was. She had written to a foreign enemy at enormous personal risk, offering the throne of Egypt to a stranger, for the express purpose of not being taken by a servant of her own house. And the man she ended up married to was the one she had grown up calling grandfather, and he was old enough to have held her mother as a baby. And the ring was made, and the scribes wrote it down. And everybody carried on. And then she is gone. Not killed, that we know of. Simply not mentioned again. She is not in A's tomb. She does not appear as his queen anywhere else. There is no grave. She was about 22. So take the whole family and set it out, because it is worth doing once. Plainly, 6 daughters were born in that city in the light, with the rays coming down and the little hands at the end of them. 4 of them are simply gone from the record before they are grown. Meketaten died at about 12, and her parents were carved bent over her bed. Meritaten carried the weight of the last years and then stops. And Ankhesenamun, the survivor, the one who lasted, buried her sisters and her father and her mother and her husband and both her babies, was married at the end to an old man to legitimize his crown, and then vanished at 22. Not one of them has a known grave, and then Egypt set about making sure that none of it had ever happened. The erasure took a generation, and it was thorough, and it was official. It started quietly, under the boy king, with the reopening of the temples. It became systematic under I, and it became total under Horemheb, the general, the last man standing, who took the throne when I died, and who had no blood claim to anything, and therefore needed the recent past to be a crime he had helped correct. Akhenaten was struck out of the record, not merely neglected, deleted. When the king lists were compiled, the official rolls of every pharaoh who had ever legitimately ruled Egypt, the whole Amarna sequence, is simply missing. Amenhotep III is followed straight by Horemheb, as though the 17 years of Akhenaten and whatever came after had not occurred at all. Horemheb dated his own reign as though it had begun the moment Amenhotep III died, absorbing the entire heresy into his own regnal years like a man swallowing something he does not want. Found. And when they had to refer to Akhenaten, they would not say his name. He is the criminal. He is that enemy. He is the enemy of Akhetaten, which is a magnificent piece of spite when you consider that Akhetaten was his own city, and the city itself was taken to pieces. Not smashed for the pleasure of it, quarried, methodically, for materials, because a whole capital's worth of dressed stone lying about unused was an asset, and Egypt was practical. The temples of the Aten were pulled down, and the blocks were carted across the river and up and down the country and built into other people's pylons. There is a place on the west bank almost opposite, Hermopolis, where a later king built a great gateway, and when it was opened up, out came Akhetaten, thousands upon thousands of Talatat, with the painted faces of Nefertiti and her daughters still on them, packed inside the wall of a temple to a different god. The statues were smashed, the names were cut out. Where the royal family had been carved, the figures were hacked away, and you can go and stand in front of those surfaces now and see the chisel marks, and they are not weathering. They are somebody's afternoon, and the tombs in the eastern cliffs were entered, and the burials broken up, and whoever was in the royal tomb was taken out of it or destroyed in it. And that is a large part of why we cannot find her. And the man who finished the job deserves a moment, because he is the reason it was so thorough, and because his own story is the last irony in this. Horemheb was a soldier. He was not royal in any degree. He came from a provincial town, from a family nobody recorded. And he rose through the army by being good at it. And he rose the whole way. Under Akhenaten, he was already a senior man. Under Tutankhamun, he was the commander-in-chief and the deputy of the king in the whole land, which is about as much power as a man could hold without the crown. And when the boy died, and the old courtier took the throne and reigned 4 years and died in his turn, there was nobody left with a drop of the blood, and Horemheb simply took it. And he had a problem, and it was the same problem the Amarna family had left behind them, and it was legitimacy. He had no claim, none, not by birth, not by marriage worth the name, not by anything. So he did what men in that position have always done. He made the recent past into a crime, and himself into the man who ended it. He dated his own reign, as though it had started the day Amenhotep III died swallowing Akhenaten's 17 years, and the female kings, and Tutankhamun's and I's, all of it, into his own count. So that on paper, he was the direct successor of the last legitimate pharaoh, and the heresy had never taken place. He tore down what was left at Karnak, and used it as fill. He took Tutankhamun's own monuments, and put his name on them. He took eyes, he went after the tombs, and he was, by every measure we have, an excellent king. That is the part that sticks. He reigned for over a decade. He rebuilt the temples. He restored the administration. He issued a great decree against corruption in the provinces which survives, and which is a genuinely impressive piece of government. Protecting ordinary people from officials who were seizing their boats and their hides and their grain, with real penalties for the officials. He put Egypt back together. He handed on a functioning state to the man who founded the next dynasty, and out of that dynasty came Ramesses. So Egypt got a good ruler, and the price was a family erased. And here is the thing that I find genuinely difficult, and I will just put in front of you rather than pretend to resolve it. Horemheb was there. He served Akhenaten. He was in that city. He would have stood in the crowd under the window. He would have known Nefertiti by sight. Would have seen her in the chariot. Would have watched those 6 girls grow up. Whatever he thought of it at the time, he did his job in it and prospered. And 30 years later, he was the man methodically ensuring that none of them had ever existed. I do not know what to do with that. And I am suspicious of anyone who does. It is possible he had hated it from the start, and was purging something he believed had nearly destroyed his country. It is possible he had believed in it once, and turned. It is possible he thought nothing at all about it, and that the erasure was simply administration, the way Kia's canopic jars were administration, and that most of the damage humans do to each other is done by people who are not thinking about it. What I do know is that a general who had bowed under that window put out the order, and the chisels went to work. And it very nearly took. Here is what I keep turning over about that. It nearly worked. That is the thing. It very nearly worked completely. For 3,000 years. Nobody had the faintest idea. The whole episode fell out of history so cleanly that when the Greeks came, and then the Romans, and then everybody else, and they asked the Egyptians about their past, the Amarna years were not in it. This was not a scandal hushed up. It was an absence. Egypt had a continuous, official, immensely detailed record of its own kings going back millennia, and there was a 17-year hole in it that no one could detect, because the men who dug the hole had also filled it in. The name of the most famous woman in the ancient world was, for 100 generations, not known to a single living person, and it came back for the dullest possible reason. They built with the rubble, But let me tell you how it actually came back, because the work of putting her together again is one of the great quiet achievements of the last century, and hardly anyone knows it happened. When the demolition crews took the Eton temples at Karnak apart, they packed the blocks inside the new pylons, the enormous gateway towers of later kings, as rubble fill, face inwards, at random in their tens of thousands, stacked out of the light. And there they lay until the 1920s. When a pylon at Karnak needed repair, and the engineers opened it up, and out poured Akhenaten's temples, over 40,000 of them. Painted, bright, each one a fragment of a scene about the size of a page, an eye, a hand, part of a chariot wheel, half a hieroglyph, a piece of an arm, all shuffled, all out of order. From at least 4 different buildings, mixed together, with no plan of what had been on any wall in the first place. It is the largest jigsaw ever set, and no one could do it, because you cannot lay that many stones out on the ground and walk about among them for the 50 years it would take. So in the 1960s, an American team did something that sounds obvious now and was not obvious at all then. They photographed every block, one by one, to a standard, and they described what was on each one in a code, and they put the whole thing into a computer. This is one of the earliest uses of computing in the humanities anywhere in the world. A mainframe in the 60s, being asked to find which piece of a queen's arm fits which piece of a queen's shoulder. And it worked. Slowly, over decades, walls came back. Whole scenes reassembled on paper and then in reality. And what came out of those pylons was the temple where Nefertiti stood alone before her god, and the scenes of her officiating with no king present. The single most important evidence for what she was recovered from inside a monument raised by a man who was trying to make certain nobody would ever know she existed. He used her as gravel because the blocks were the right size, and the right size is also what let us put her back. There is one more thing about those blocks that I love, and it is very small, because each block was cut for one man to carry. The scenes are assembled out of pieces about the size of a hand. So when you stand in a museum now and look at a reconstructed Amarna scene, you are looking at hundreds of separate little stones, each of which was carried by somebody, in the heat, in a line, 33 centuries ago, up a ramp on that gravel. The whole of her temple went up hand to hand. And it came back the same way, one piece at a time, out of the dark, by people who never met her and would not stop looking. The talatat were the right size. They were small and square and quick to handle. And that is precisely why the demolition crews packed them inside the new pylons, instead of carting them to a lime kiln. And that is why so many of them are sitting in museums now with the paint still on. The erasure preserved the thing it erased, because it was in a hurry and the bricks were handy. Everything we have of her, we have because somebody used her face as hardcore. So how did any of it come back? That is worth an answer, because the finding of Amarna is a story in itself, and it is mostly a story about people not understanding what was in front of them. The site was never entirely lost. It could not be. There are tombs cut into cliffs and stelae the size of doors, and local people had always known they were there. Travellers came through in the 17 and 1800s and copied things. Napoleon's expedition mapped it. But no one could put a name to it, because the name had been taken off and the figures had been hacked away. And what they were looking at was a ruined town belonging to a king whose existence was not recorded anywhere. Then the writing was cracked in the 1820s, and slowly the strange king came out of the stone. A pharaoh no one had ever heard of, in a city that appeared on no list, worshipping a god out of nowhere, in a style that did not look Egyptian at all. For a while the field could not even agree whether he was a man or a woman, because of the way he chose to have himself carved. And then came the tablets out of the ground, and the whole diplomatic archive of the age was very nearly lost, because the dealers had them first, and the experts said they were forgeries. It took years to establish that the most important cache of documents ever found in Egypt was real, and by then, a good many of them had been broken up and scattered. And some are simply gone. Then Flinders Petrie went there, and Petrie is the man who invented archaeology as a discipline rather than a treasure hunt. The one who worked out that you record everything, that the potsherds matter as much as the gold, that a smashed floor tile in position tells you more than a statue with no context. He dug at Amarna at the very end of that century, and he found the painted floors of the palace, and he did what none of his predecessors had thought to do. He wrote the ordinary things down, and then the Germans came. And then the British came back, and they are still there. That is the part I find quietly moving. The Egypt Exploration Society has been working at Amarna, on and off, for a century, and the project has run continuously in recent decades. And what they have been doing lately is not looking for treasure at all. They have been excavating the graves of the poor. They have been weighing the bones and measuring the spines and working out what those people ate and how they died, because that is now understood to be the real story of the place. And it is the story that was never carved anywhere, 3,500 years after a king built a city to hold a god that shone on everybody without partiality. Somebody finally went out into the sand and counted the people it fell on. And that brings us to a morning in December in the year 1912, and to the reason you know her at all. There was a German team digging at Amarna, the German Oriental Society, funded by a wealthy Berlin merchant, James Simon, and led by an Egyptologist and architectural historian, Ludwig Borchardt. They had been at it for 2 seasons, working across the residential city, opening one building after another. The site had been mapped and squared off into a grid, and each building was numbered by the square it stood in, which is why the most famous find in the history of Egyptian art carries a name like a parking space, House P 47.2. It turned out to be a workshop, and it belonged to a man whose name has come down to us, because his ivory horse blinker was lying in it with his title on it, Thutmose, the king's favourite, and master of works, the sculptor. He was the court sculptor, the man whose job was the official likeness of the royal family, which in that reign was the official likeness of God's own household. And his premises had been sitting out there in the sand, undisturbed, for 3,300 years. And on the 6th of December, they came to it. Borchardt's diary is the record of the find, and the line everybody quotes is the one he wrote that evening. And it is the least professional and most human sentence in the whole of Egyptology. He tried to describe it and gave up. No use describing it. He wrote, "It must be seen. She is about 1/2 meter high and weighs around 20 kilograms. She is not carved from a single block. There is a limestone core, and on top of that, the sculptor modelled the whole surface in plaster. The cheekbones, the lips, the long neck, the crown, which is what let him get the delicacy, because plaster will take a touch, that stone will not. And then she was painted, and the paint is still there, the skin, the red of the mouth, the blue of the crown, with a golden band round it like a ribbon. And there is a cobra over her brow, or there was, because it has broken away. And she has one eye. The right eye is rock crystal, polished, set in with black beeswax. And it is the reason she looks at you. The left socket is empty and always was. There is no inlay lost in the sand. Borchardt looked and wrote in his diary that there had never been one, and no trace of adhesive where it would have sat. And the explanation is not tragic, and it is not a mystery, and it is better than either. She is a model. That is what the missing eye tells you. It was never meant to go anywhere or be seen by anybody. It was a master study, kept in the workshop as the authoritative likeness of the Queen's face, for the other sculptors to copy when they had to produce her image for a temple or a stela. The 2 eyes are a teaching aid. Here is one left blank. Here is one carried through to the end. This is how it is done. So the most famous portrait in the ancient world is a piece of studio equipment. It is the thing that was lying on the shelf. It was never displayed, never dedicated. never given to a god, never put in a tomb. It is the sculptor's own reference copy of a woman's face. And it survived because he did not think it was worth taking with him. And she was not alone in that room. And this is the part of the find that people almost never hear about. And it is in some ways more moving than the famous head. Thutmose's workshop was full of heads. When they cleared it, out came something over 20 plaster studies, and a quantity of stone ones, and unfinished pieces, and a whole working collection. There is Akhenaten. There is another head of Nefertiti, an unfinished one in brown quartzite, with the guidelines still drawn on it in ink, where the sculptor had marked out what he still meant to cut, which is the closest you will ever come to standing at his shoulder. There are the daughters, at various ages. There is I, most likely, and there are the others. The others are the ones that stay with you. Old men, one with a hooked nose and a lined cheek and a mouth that turns down. A woman past her youth with folds in her neck. Wrinkles, sagging skin, crooked features, all the ordinary damage of having lived modelled with a delicacy and an attention that is frankly unbearable when you think about what Egyptian art had been doing for the previous 2,000 years, which was making everybody young and correct forever. Nobody knows who they are. They are unnamed. They are almost certainly the court, the officials, the wives, the people around the family, and they have come down to us as a room full of anonymous, particular, unmistakably individual human beings. From a civilization that had spent 2 millennia insisting that individuality was not the point. There is an argument about what those plaster heads actually were. Casts made from life, perhaps, or from a clay model, worked from life. Study pieces, reference, whatever they were technically. What they are, in effect, is a portrait gallery of people who were alive at Amarna in the 14th century, before our era, with their own features on them, and it was all abandoned. That is the thing. Thutmose walked out of that studio and left the whole of it. The queen, the king, the children, the old men, the unfinished quartzite head with the ink lines still on it. And he shut the door and went away down the river with everybody else. Why? He must have had somewhere to go. The court was moving, and the sculptors moved with the court. And the work would be at Memphis now. Maybe there was no room on the boat for plaster. Maybe he thought he would come back. Maybe an order had come down that this material was not to leave, because it was the likeness of a family that was about to stop existing. Or maybe, and I think this is the likeliest and the saddest, none of it was worth anything. It was studio stock. The temples it had been made for were about to be pulled down. Nobody was going to commission another image of that woman ever again in the whole future of the world. And he knew it, and he walked away from his reference copies because they had become, overnight, the models for a thing that would never be made. He was wrong by 3,300 years, and he was wrong by more than any craftsman in history. The piece he abandoned on a shelf as worthless is now, by some distance, the most reproduced sculpture ever made by human hands. And then the rest of it, which is not comfortable, and which I am going to give you plainly, because it is part of her story now, whether we like it or not. The bust went to Germany, under the system of the day. Finds were divided between the excavators and Egypt, and at a meeting in January of 1913, the division was agreed, and the bust went into the German share. Egypt has argued ever since that the division was not honest, that its value was played down, that it was described in a way that did not convey what it was, that a photograph did not do it justice, that the official who agreed to it did not understand what he was letting go. Germany has maintained throughout that the paperwork was proper and the transfer was legal. I am not able to settle that, and I am not going to pretend to. What is true is that she left, and that for the first 12 years, she was not in a museum at all. She was in James Simon's own home, in Berlin, kept quiet. And then she went on show, and she became instantly, enormously famous. And Egypt has been asking for her back ever since. And the answer has been no. Her century was not gentle. She spent part of the war in the cellar of a bank, and then in a salt mine at Merkers, deep underground, with a good deal of Germany's other treasure, and she came out of that mine into the hands of American soldiers. And afterwards, she was in a divided city and moved from one collection to another. Since 2009, she has been at the Neues Museum in Berlin, in a room of her own. And something over 500,000 people a year go and stand in front of her. They look at her, and she looks past them with one eye. So where is she? That is the question we end on. And the answer is that nobody can say. There is no tomb we can point to. The one Akhenaten cut for her in the eastern hills, and named on the boundary stele before the city existed, was made and prepared, and as far as anybody can tell, never used. Or used and emptied. There are fragments of Shabtis, the little servant figures that go into a royal burial carrying her name, and they are in the Louvre and in Brooklyn, and they are the only physical trace of her funeral we have. And a handful of broken figurines is not a grave. There have been claims. In 2015, a British Egyptologist argued from the high-resolution scans that the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb concealed further chambers, that the tomb was too small and oddly shaped for a king, that it had been adapted, and that behind one wall lay the original occupant, and that the original occupant was Nefertiti. It was a beautiful argument. It ran round the world. Radar surveys were done, and one seemed to show something, and then another was done and showed nothing, and a third was done, and the consensus now is that there is no hidden chamber. It is over. It was a lovely idea. And there is the younger lady, a body found long ago in a side chamber of another tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a woman, damaged, who for a while was proposed as Nefertiti. The genetic work identifies her as Tutankhamun's mother and as a daughter of Amenhotep III, which is to say a sister of Akhenaten, which Nefertiti, on all the evidence, was not. So, there it is. We do not have her. Somewhere in that country there is a woman who was queen of the greatest power on earth, who officiated to her god where only kings had stood, who very probably ruled Egypt herself at the end, and whose face is the most reproduced object out of the entire ancient world, and not one person alive can tell you where she lies. And there is something in that I find I do not mind as much as I expected to, because think about what they wanted. They wanted her gone, not dead. She was already dead, gone, cancelled, unhappened. Her name off the stone, and her city in somebody else's wall, and the whole of her life removed from the list of things that had occurred. That was the intention, and it was carried out by the full authority of the Egyptian state. And it was the most successful erasure in recorded history for 3,000 years. And what actually happened is this. The chisels took the temples and left the rubble, and the rubble had her face on it. The sand took the city and preserved it better than any inhabited place in Egypt. So that Akhetaten is now the best-known ancient town in the world, precisely because it was abandoned. And the sculptor left the one object he thought was worthless, the studio copy with the unfinished eye. And it turned out to be the thing that made her immortal. They erased her so completely that she came back looking like a miracle. And the mystery they left us, the missing tomb, the missing body, the vanishing, is the reason her name is still moving through the world tonight, 3,500 years later, in a language none of them ever heard, spoken in rooms they could not have imagined. Let all of that settle now and stay where it belongs. There is nothing in it for you to carry. It is finished, and it has been finished for a very long time. The cliffs, and the 700 altars in the sun, and the bricks lying out to bake, and the 2 little girls on the cushion, and the man in the quarry scratching a date onto a wall without any idea what he was doing for us. The city is quiet. The wind put the sand back a long time ago, and the light still comes down over that bay of desert every morning the way it did when they were all alive. And it does not need anybody to watch it. Let your own weight go down a little further into the bed. There is nothing to solve tonight, and no weight to hold. and nowhere at all to be. If these long evenings in other centuries are a comfort to you, and you would like to slip away into another one on some future night when rest is slow in coming, you are always welcome to subscribe, and to let these hours find their way back to you. There is no hurry in it, and nothing to do about it now. And it means a great deal to me that you have spent this evening here. You have gone far enough. You have been 3,500 years down and to the other side of the world and back. And you have earned the right to lie still. So let the pictures go soft. The blue crown, the hands coming down out of the sky, the painted floors, the empty streets going quietly back to sand. And let them fade gently into the dark behind your eyes. And let yourself sink, at your own pace, down into the deep and easy sleep that is waiting for you. Sleep well, stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.